Invite her. I want every guest in that room to see exactly what my son married." The words came through a speakerphone, propped against a crystal vase on a marble countertop. The kind of countertop that cost more than most people earned in a year. Constance Pemberton stood at the kitchen island of her Stamford estate, scrolling through a guest list on her tablet with one manicured finger, pausing on a name she'd spent 3 years trying to erase from her family's story. "You're serious?" Margot Sterling's voice crackled through the speaker, equal parts disbelief and amusement. "After 3 years of pretending she doesn't exist, you want to actually put her in the room? I want her at table 14, the one near the kitchen entrance." Constance's tone carried no anger, just the cold surgical precision of a woman who'd spent decades arranging people like furniture. "I want 200 donors to watch her try to hold a conversation about philanthropy while wearing whatever she found at the Goodwill clearance rack. And I want my son to finally see what the rest of us have seen since the day he brought her home." Constance Pemberton had hosted the annual Foundation Charity Gala for 19 consecutive years. She had never once lost control of a room. She had never once been surprised by an outcome she hadn't orchestrated. In 72 hours, both of those records would shatter, because the woman she'd just invited to be humiliated was the anonymous donor who'd funded the entire $3.2 million evening. And Constance didn't have the faintest idea. The email went out 40 minutes later. Subject line, Gala Guest Editions. Sent from Constance's personal account at 6:14 p.m., October 1st. The body read, "Add Nadine Pemberton to table 14, near the kitchen entrance. Use a folding chair if necessary." The event coordinator's reply arrived 9 minutes later. One word that set the entire machinery of humiliation into motion. Confirmed. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Stay right here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens at that gala will leave you absolutely speechless. To understand what happened on the night of October 4th at the Pemberton estate, you have to understand two women, and the distance between their worlds, a distance measured not in miles, but in assumptions. Nadine's morning started at 5:45 a.m. in a one-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Unit 4B, third floor of a walk-up on State Street, where the elevator had been broken since August, and the hallway carried the permanent ghost of someone else's cooking. The apartment was small, clean, sparse in the way that could mean poverty or could mean discipline, and everyone who saw it assumed the former without pausing to consider the latter. She made her bed with corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. Not the loose toss and smooth most people managed in the morning fog, but precise folds, the fitted sheet pulled taut, the top sheet creased at exact right angles, the single pillow centered with a symmetry that seemed excessive for a woman living alone. Her bag sat by the door, packed the night before. Phone in the exterior pocket. Small leather notebook in the front zip compartment, always within reach. 3 pens arranged by color, black, blue, red, in the interior sleeve. She checked the deadbolt, turned the knob to confirm the latch, checked the deadbolt again. Then a third time. Not anxiety, not compulsion. Something older than that. Something drilled into muscle memory over years until it became as automatic as breathing. The kind of habit that forms in environments where missed steps carry consequences no one wants to pay. She took the number 17 bus to downtown Stamford. 42 minutes, 4th row, left side, nearest the exit. She read from a manila folder thick with financial documents, columns of numbers, highlighted passages, handwritten notes in margins so small they'd need a magnifying glass to decipher. To the other passengers, she was invisible. A quiet black woman in her early 40s commuting to whatever quiet job quiet women commuted to. Slacks and a blouse, clean and pressed but visibly not new. No jewelry except a thin wedding band. No designer handbag. No visible evidence of anything that might make a person look twice. Her stop was Franklin Street, 2 blocks from a narrow storefront with a sign reading Eastside Legal Aid Clinic in faded blue lettering. She arrived at 7:15, unlocked the front door herself. The receptionist didn't come in until 9, and started the coffee machine before sitting at a desk buried under case files. Housing discrimination claims, wage theft complaints, tenant disputes with landlords who knew their tenants couldn't afford representation and counted on that knowledge like a loaded weapon. Her neighbors in the building knew her as the quiet woman who helped with paperwork. Mrs. Delgado in 4A had brought a lease dispute to Nadine 6 months ago, a landlord refusing to repair a gas leak that had already sent her youngest to the emergency room twice. Nadine had reviewed the lease, highlighted 3 separate violations of Connecticut General Statute Section 47A-4, and drafted a letter to the property management company that resulted in repairs being completed within 11 days. She didn't charge a penny. Mr. OC and 3C had needed help filing a wage claim against a restaurant that owed him 4 months of overtime. Nadine walked him through the Department of Labor complaint process step by step, with the patience of someone who understood that legal systems were designed to exhaust ordinary people into silence, and that sometimes the only thing standing between a person and injustice was someone willing to sit at a kitchen table and explain the forms. She did this work without fanfare, without a single person in that building suspecting that the woman helping them navigate small claims court might be anything more than a kind neighbor who'd picked up some legal knowledge along the way. 3 years earlier, Wesley Pemberton III had married Nadine over the explicit, sustained, and creatively expressed objection of his mother. Wesley was 44, sandy-haired, mild-mannered, a man who'd inherited enough money to never need ambition and enough conscience to feel guilty about it. He'd met Nadine at a fundraiser for housing equity in New Haven. She'd been one of the speakers. He'd been one of the donors. And something about the way she talked about justice, not as a feeling, but as a structural problem with structural solutions, had made him lean forward in his chair and actually listen for the first time in years. Constance had tried everything. First came the concerned conversation over brunch at the country club. "Darling, I'm sure she's lovely, but have you considered what people will think? The Pembertons have a reputation to maintain." When concern failed, she escalated to strategy, hiring a private investigator to dig into Nadine's background. The investigator found nothing. No criminal record, no debt, no scandal. Just a woman who'd grown up in Bridgeport, attended college on scholarships, and spent her career in work that didn't generate headlines or wealth. The absence of ammunition infuriated Constance more than any scandal would have. When strategy failed, Constance turned to exclusion, the Thanksgiving where she set no place for Nadine at the table. "Oh, I thought Wesley said you had other plans." The Christmas gift that arrived in a box from Bloomingdale's, but contained a self-help book titled Dressing for the Life You Want. The family brunch where Gemma Schofield, Wesley's ex-girlfriend, still orbiting the Pemberton solar system like a satellite that refused to deorbit, sent Nadine directions to the service entrance instead of the main door, then feigned horror at the mix-up. Each incident, Nadine documented, not publicly, not dramatically. She took a photo, saved a text, wrote a date and a description in her leather notebook, the same notebook she carried in her bag every morning, the one with the 3 pens arranged by color, black for facts, blue for observations, red for things that would matter later. 3 years of entries, 3 years of patience. And now, an invitation to the one event Constance controlled more completely than any other. The annual gala, where the Pemberton name meant power and money and social gravity that could crush anyone who didn't belong. Wesley told Nadine about the invitation on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the second-hand couch in her Bridgeport apartment. He looked uncomfortable, the way he always looked when his mother's world and his wife's world threatened to collide. "She wants you there." He said it like he couldn't quite believe it himself. "The gala, Saturday night." Nadine didn't look up from the folder she was reading. "Will the Foundation's annual audit be presented at the gala?" Wesley blinked. Of all the questions he'd expected. "What should I wear? Why now? Is this a trap?" That wasn't one of them. "The audit? Yeah, it's tradition. Mom presents the annual numbers to the donors. Why?" "Then I'll be there." She turned a page in her folder, highlighted something in red, and that was the end of the conversation. Though Wesley didn't realize it was also the beginning of something else entirely. 3 days before the gala, Constance Pemberton's living room, though calling it a living room was like calling the Atlantic Ocean a pond. 14-foot ceilings, crown molding that had been hand-carved in 1924. Furniture that existed not to be sat on, but to communicate taste and lineage, and the kind of permanence that only generational wealth could buy. Margot Sterling occupied the settee nearest the fireplace, legs crossed, champagne flute in hand, despite it being 2 in the afternoon. Gemma Schofield perched on the wing-back chair by the window, scrolling through her phone with the focused energy of someone who used social media the way a sniper used a rifle scope. The dress code is black tie formal. Constance stood at the mantelpiece, tapping a printed seating chart with her reading glasses. "She won't have a gown. She can barely afford the bus fare to get here." "What if Wesley buys her something?" Margot asked. "Wesley won't think of it until the night of. He never does." Constance's lip curled with the particular contempt mothers reserve for sons who disappoint them in the specific way of choosing their own wives. "She'll show up in whatever she owns that's closest to formal, and it will be obvious, to everyone." "I can help with that." Gemma didn't look up from her phone. I'll position myself near the entrance when she arrives. First impressions, you know? I'll make sure everyone notices her before she can find a corner to hide in. Margot swirled her champagne. Should we feel guilty about this? Guilt is for people who don't control the guest list. Constance tapped table 14 on the chart, tucked behind a structural pillar adjacent to the kitchen service door, positioned so that anyone seated there would spend the evening being bumped by waitstaff, carrying trays and catching the smell of dishwashing detergent every time the door swung open. She'll be visible enough to be seen, invisible enough to be ignored, and by the end of the evening, Wesley will understand what the rest of us have understood for 3 years, which is that she's a phase, and phases end. The seating chart went to the event coordinator that afternoon. The security briefing went to Vance Kellner, 6'3", ex-military private contractor, head of estate security, at 2:14 p.m. via email. Subject line, special attention guest. Body, Nadine Pemberton. Attached photo. If she causes any disruption, remove her immediately. Photograph any incidents for documentation. Do not defer to Wesley on this matter. Kellner read the email, saved the photo to his phone, and replied with a thumbs-up emoji. He didn't ask questions. 7 years working for Constance Pemberton had taught him that the woman who signed his paychecks expected compliance, not curiosity. That same evening, in the Bridgeport apartment, Nadine sat at her desk under a lamp that threw a cone of yellow light across stacks of paper. Not case files from the clinic. Different documents. Thicker. Financial statements with columns of figures and footnotes dense enough to require a forensic accountant to decode. She moved through them with a speed that suggested deep familiarity. Not reading for the first time, but reviewing, confirming, checking numbers she'd already committed to memory against their printed counterparts. She picked up her phone, dialed from memory. I need the final reconciliation by Thursday. Her voice was quiet, steady, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to giving instructions that got followed. The overhead ratio has to be documented to the decimal. If the administrative line items don't match the vendor invoices, I need the discrepancy report before Saturday. She listened, nodded. Good. Send the updated summary to my secure email. Not the clinic address. The other one. She hung up, dialed again. It's me. The annual report will be presented Saturday evening. If those figures match what I've been tracking for 14 months, I'll need you in the room. A pause. Formal attire. You'll be there as catering management. Helen has your credentials arranged. Be ready. 2 calls. No names spoken on her end. No explanations given. She set the phone face down on the desk and sat for a moment, looking at the numbers spread before her like a map of someone else's greed. Then she stood, walked to her closet, and reached past the everyday clothes, the slacks and blouses, and the one slightly nicer jacket she wore to court appearances, to the very back. Her fingers found a garment bag, black, zipped, hanging from a padded hanger she'd placed there 3 years ago, when she moved into this apartment and began the patient work of becoming invisible. She touched the zipper. Didn't pull it. Not yet. Saturday. She closed the closet and returned to the desk, picked up the red pen, drew a small circle around a number on page 47 of the Foundation's annual report. $842,000 paid to Sterling Consulting Group, LLC. Drew another circle on page 49. $412,000 to Schofield and Associates. Turned to the final page. Total charitable disbursements to designated beneficiaries. After-school programs, housing assistance, community health services, $690,000 out of $3.2 million raised. She set down the pen, closed the folder, and in the small, quiet apartment where everyone assumed she had nothing, Nadine began her final preparations for the most important evening of her life. October 4th broke cold and bright over Fairfield County. At the Pemberton estate, a fleet of vendors had been working since dawn. Florists arranged centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus, $600 per table, 22 tables, plus the head table arrangement at $1,400. A lighting crew adjusted the crystal chandeliers to cast the specific golden warmth that made everyone look 10 years younger and 50% more generous. The catering team from Enzo's, New Haven's most exclusive restaurant, booked 11 months in advance, unloaded beef tenderloin and lobster bisque from refrigerated trucks, while the pastry chef personally transported 200 individual chocolate torts in temperature-controlled cases. Constance moved through it all like a general before battle. She checked the napkin folds, cathedral, not bishop. Questioned the wine selection. The Barolo was correct, but the Sancerre was a year too young. Stood at table 14 and confirmed, With satisfaction, she didn't bother concealing that the folding chair was noticeably shorter than the upholstered seats at every other table, that the pillar blocked the stage view, and that the kitchen service door would swing open approximately every 90 seconds throughout dinner, flooding whoever sat there with noise and steam and the institutional smell of commercial dishwashing. Perfect, she said it to no one, or to herself, or to the architecture of humiliation she'd spent 3 days constructing. Paige Whitfield arrived at 6:20. Corporate counsel at Crane Whitfield LLP, a firm that handled governance consulting for half the charitable foundations in Fairfield County. Navy gown, diamond earrings that threw small rainbows when they caught the chandelier light. Constance intercepted her in the foyer with the precision of a hostess who'd memorized every guest's arrival window. Wesley's wife might try to make conversation tonight. Constance touched Paige's arm, the gesture of a woman deploying an asset. She works at some little legal aid shop in Bridgeport. If she starts talking about law, just keep her honest, would you? Better she hears it from you than from someone less gracious. Paige's smile carried the specific warmth people reserve for charity cases and rescue animals. I'd be happy to help. By 7, the ballroom held over 160 guests. String quartet in the east corner, champagne on silver trays, conversation at the particular frequency of people performing ease while calculating advantage. Margot Sterling worked the room like a press secretary, greeting, cataloging, accumulating social intelligence she'd redistribute through her society column with the precision of a guided missile. Gemma Schofield had stationed herself at the main entrance, champagne in one hand, phone angled for candid photos in the other. Wesley arrived at 7:10, alone. He'd texted Nadine twice asking if she wanted a ride from Bridgeport. She'd declined both times. I'll get there on my own. Save me a dance. He stood near the bar, nursing a club soda, scanning the entrance every 30 seconds with the anxious energy of a man caught between two gravitational forces. His mother materialized beside him. She's not here yet? Constance didn't wait for an answer. I'm sure traffic from Bridgeport is terrible this time of evening. The emphasis on Bridgeport landed exactly where she intended, loud enough for the couple at the neighboring table to register the geography and its implications. She'll be here, Mother. Of course she will. Table 14, near the kitchen. I made sure she'd be comfortable. She touched his cheek and disappeared before he could respond. 7:22 p.m. The main doors opened. Nadine walked in alone. The dress was simple. Black, floor-length, clean lines, zero embellishment. Not designer, not couture. The kind of garment that on a hanger looked like nothing remarkable, but on a woman who moved the way Nadine moved, with a stillness that had weight, it became something that made people look and then look away and then look back again, unable to identify what had caught their attention. No jewelry except the thin wedding band and small pearl earrings. No clutch. Just a slim leather folder tucked under her left arm, so unobtrusive that most people wouldn't notice it. The few who did would dismiss it as a program or a charity brochure. None of them would guess what it actually contained. She paused in the doorway for 2 seconds, not hesitating, scanning. Her eyes moved across the ballroom with a speed and efficiency that didn't match the quiet woman from the Bridgeport bus stop, cataloging the exits, the security positions, the clusters of social power, the sightlines from the stage. 2 seconds. Then she stepped forward. Gemma was on her in 3 strides. Nadine, you made it! The greeting was pitched to carry 20 feet in every direction, turning heads like a flare launched into a dark room. Gemma air-kissed both cheeks with the intimacy of a woman establishing territory, then stepped back and let her eyes travel. Slowly, deliberately, with the expertise of someone who'd been weaponizing fashion judgment since boarding school. From Nadine's hemline to her neckline, I love your dress. The emphasis on love inverted the word into its opposite. Is that from the consignment shop on Main Street? The one next to the laundromat? Laughter. Soft, scattered, but present, enough to achieve the effect Gemma wanted. The sound of a room categorizing a newcomer as entertainment rather than peer. Nadine smiled, not the tight, defensive smile of a woman absorbing a hit. Something else, patient, almost warm, the kind of expression that made Gemma's confidence stutter for half a second before recovering. Good evening, Gemma. You look wonderful. No counterpunch, no defense, no stammering. Just composure so complete that Gemma, who'd prepared choreography for tears and retreats and humiliated silence, found herself standing in the wreckage of a response she couldn't turn into a weapon. Nadine stepped past her toward the ballroom. Gemma wasn't finished. She caught Nadine's elbow, not gently, but with the possessive grip of a woman accustomed to steering people she considered beneath her, and turned her back toward the cluster of onlookers. Wait, let me get a picture of us, for the family album. Gemma raised her phone with one hand while pulling Nadine close with the other, angling the shot so the nearest guests were visible in the background. The grip on Nadine's elbow tightened as Gemma positioned her like a prop, shifting her shoulders, tilting her chin with 2 fingers on her jaw, arranging the scene the way a photographer arranges furniture. Smile, sweetheart. You look a little tense. The shutter clicked 3 times. Gemma released her and inspected the photos with theatrical slowness. Adorable. I'll send these to you. Oh wait, are you on Instagram? Probably not, right? Never mind. She turned to the cluster of guests who'd watched the exchange and stage whispered loud enough for Nadine to hear every syllable. She's actually kind of sweet, isn't she? Like a puppy at a horse show. The laughter was louder this time, less guarded. Gemma had given the room permission to be openly cruel, and several guests accepted with the enthusiasm of people who enjoyed watching someone else be the target. Nadine didn't wipe her jaw where Gemma's fingers had pressed, didn't check whether the photos were unflattering, didn't flinch at the puppy comment or the laughter or the particular violence of being physically arranged by someone who considered her a mannequin. She walked into the ballroom, crossed 20 feet of hardwood floor, under the weight of 100 watching eyes, and found her assigned seat. Table 14. The folding chair, the pillar, the kitchen door already swinging. She sat, adjusted the shorter seat without a word of complaint, and placed her leather folder on the table beside her water glass. Howard, the elderly, half-deaf gentleman who was the only other person assigned to table 14, gave her a friendly nod. She nodded back. She didn't touch the champagne. The flute sat where the waiter placed it, untouched, for the rest of the evening. She drank water, stayed sharp, stayed still, and watched the room with the focus of someone who wasn't attending a party, but conducting surveillance from inside it. At 7:45, Constance took the stage. The podium was mahogany, custom-built, engraved with the Pemberton Foundation crest. Behind it, a screen displayed the logo and the words, Annual Report to Donors, in gold serif lettering. Constance stood in a silver gown that caught the light like polished armor, and she commanded the room the way she'd commanded every room she'd entered for half a century. Good evening, and welcome to the 19th Annual Pemberton Foundation Charity Gala. Applause. Practiced, warm. The sound of people who wanted to be seen appreciating. This foundation has always believed in the power of genuine generosity, not just writing checks, but building community, opening doors. She paused, and her gaze traveled, with the unhurried precision of a spotlight, to table 14. Welcoming all members of our family, the ones we're born into, and the ones who find their way in. The silence that followed was louder than the laughter. 200 people understood. 200 sets of eyes made the same journey Constance's had. From the stage to the folding chair behind the pillar, where a woman in a simple black dress sat with her hands folded and her face absolutely, maddeningly, impenetrably calm. Nadine raised her water glass, nodded once toward the stage with an expression of such serene composure that Constance's rhythm broke, the pause stretching one beat too long before she recovered. To family, Constance raised her glass, and to the extraordinary generosity that makes this evening possible. The room drank. Nadine set her untouched water glass down, and beneath the table, hidden by the cloth, she opened her leather folder and began reading. At 7:55, while the room was still buzzing from Constance's toast, a man Nadine didn't recognize, tall, silver-templed, smelling of bourbon and entitlement, appeared at table 14. He was holding a full glass of red wine and wearing the glassy expression of someone who'd started drinking at 6 and hadn't found a reason to stop. "Excuse me, is this table 8? He knew it wasn't. The number 14 was printed on a gold tent card in the center of the table, visible from 6 feet away. "This is table 14, Nadine indicated the card. "Oh." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his free hand on the back of Nadine's chair, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath, close enough that his forearm brushed her shoulder blade. "Wait, you're Wesley's." He paused with exaggerated theater, as if trying to recall a particularly elusive fact. "You're the wife, right? The one from, where is it, Bridgeport?" "Yes." "That's great. Good for you." He clapped her on the shoulder. Hard. The force rocked her forward in the folding chair, which was short enough that the impact nearly tipped her toward the table edge. Wine sloshed from his glass, a ribbon of Cabernet landing on her left shoulder, soaking through the fabric of her dress in a spreading crimson stain. "Oh no, oh my, I am so sorry." His face performed regret while his eyes performed nothing. "Here, let me—" He grabbed a napkin from the table and pressed it against her shoulder, grinding the stain deeper into the fabric with each dab. His hand lingered longer than helping required, pressing against her collarbone with a familiarity that bore no relationship to assistance. "I've got it." Nadine removed his hand from her shoulder. Not aggressively, firmly. The way someone removes an object from a place it doesn't belong. "Really, I'm so clumsy. I hope the dress wasn't—" Well, he looked at the stain, at the dress, at the folding chair. "I'm sure it'll wash out. If that kind of fabric takes washing, I mean." The implication was precise. The dress was cheap enough to be disposable. He walked away without waiting for a response, rejoining a cluster near table 3 that included Margot Sterling. From the cluster, someone glanced back at table 14 and smiled. Nadine looked at the wine stain on her shoulder. Spreading, darkening, ruining the one formal dress she'd chosen to wear. She didn't go to the restroom, didn't try to clean it. She sat with the stain visible, a red badge on black fabric, and returned to the documents in her lap. The stain would photograph well. Everything tonight would photograph well. That was rather the point. Dinner service started at 8. The beef tenderloin at table 14 arrived 12 minutes after every other table. An oversight, the waiter apologized. The plate was lukewarm, the portion visibly smaller. Howard didn't notice. Nadine did. She ate without comment, using the extra 12 minutes to review pages in her lap, turning documents with the efficiency of someone confirming what she already knew, rather than learning something new. At 8:20, Gemma launched Phase 2. She crossed the ballroom carrying 2 champagne flutes, wearing concern like a costume, making sure 3 clusters of guests could see her heading toward table 14 with the body language of a woman on a mercy mission. "Nadine, how are you? All the way over here by yourself, it must be so lonely." She set a champagne flute in front of Nadine and took the chair beside her, leaning close enough that their conversation would carry to the neighboring clusters without technically being public. "I'm enjoying the evening, Gemma." "Of course you are. You're so brave to come." Gemma's hand landed on Nadine's forearm. Not a touch, a grip. Fingers wrapping around Nadine's wrist with pressure that was 1 degree past affectionate and 2 degrees into territorial. "Can I give you some advice? Woman to woman?" Nadine didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just looked at Gemma's hand on her arm with the calm, cataloging gaze of someone noting a data point. "Sure. Don't try too hard tonight. Some of these people can smell desperation. Just be quiet. Let Wesley handle the talking. That's what works best for people who are new to this world." The message was gift-wrapped in silk, but built from razor wire. You don't belong. Don't pretend. Be small. Be silent. Be nothing. 3 seconds of silence. Gemma read the silence as impact, the stunned processing of a woman who'd just been told her place. She was wrong. "I've reviewed the situation, Gemma." Nadine's voice was level, pleasant, utterly without defensiveness. "I have a strategy, but thank you." The word strategy landed wrong. It didn't fit the script. Women who were overwhelmed by wealth and status didn't talk about strategies. They talked about surviving, about getting through the evening, about not embarrassing themselves. Strategy was a word that belonged to people who controlled outcomes, and Gemma, for the first time, felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. "A strategy." Gemma's laugh was half a beat too late. "For a party?" "For the evening." Nadine turned back to her water glass, and the conversation ended, not because Gemma chose to close it, but because Nadine did. A small distinction, but Gemma felt it the way a person feels a temperature drop. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. She returned to Constance's orbit with an expression she was trying to pass off as amusement. "She's not breaking." Gemma's whisper was tight. "She's sitting there like she's waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" "I don't know. That's the problem." Constance smoothed the front of her gown. "She's performing. They all perform until the pressure builds. By dessert, she'll excuse herself to the restroom and never come back. I've seen it before." But Constance hadn't seen this before. Not exactly. She'd seen women crumble under social pressure. It was, in a way, her specialty. What she hadn't seen was a woman absorb the pressure without resistance, without defense, without any visible reaction at all. And the absence of reaction was starting to feel less like weakness and more like patience. The social hour began at 9:15. The part of the evening where guests shed their assigned seats and circulated through the ballroom in patterns dictated by ambition, curiosity, and alcohol. Nadine left table 14 and moved into the room. Not aggressively. She drifted along the perimeter, holding her water glass like a passport, pausing near conversations without intruding, watching the room's power dynamics with the focused attention of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Paige Whitfield intercepted her near the bar. "You must be Wesley's wife." Paige extended a hand with a grip calibrated to communicate authority. "Paige Whitfield, Crane Whitfield LLP. Nadine, nice to meet you. Constance tells me you work in legal aid?" The tone was warm, precise, and slightly above Nadine on some invisible hierarchy of professional seriousness. "That's so admirable. Really noble work. Thank you. The cases must be fascinating in their own way. Landlord-tenant disputes, parking violations." Paige sipped champagne with the unconscious elegance of a woman who'd grown up with stemware. Not exactly the intellectual challenge of, say, mergers and acquisitions, but important, in its way. "We handle housing discrimination primarily, wage theft, some employment law. Pro bono, of course. Mostly. Noble." Paige said the word again, and the repetition transformed it from compliment to epitaph. "I always tell my associates, pro bono work builds character, keeps you connected to real life." She leaned closer, conspiratorial. "Between us, half my team couldn't last a week without Westlaw access." Nadine tilted her head, a small movement, barely perceptible, the kind of tell a poker player would recognize as dangerous. "The research tools are different, certainly." Paige, encouraged by what she read as agreement, pushed further. "I've been doing some governance work with the Pemberton Foundation, actually. Fiduciary standards for charitable trusts in Connecticut. Complicated stuff. Won't bore you with details. Fiduciary duty is interesting." Nadine's tone was mild, conversational, entirely free of the defensiveness Paige was fishing for. "The prudent investor standard gets misapplied more often than people realize." A small pause. Paige's champagne glass hovered. "Right. Well, the reasonable person test still applies in most contexts. That's the baseline everyone works from. For tort liability, yes." Nadine said it the way someone corrects a misspelling. Without emphasis, without triumph, as though accuracy were a reflex she couldn't suppress even at a cocktail party. "But for charitable trust administration in Connecticut, the applicable standard is Section 45-234. Prudent investor, not reasonable person. Different framework entirely. Different fiduciary obligations. It's a common conflation, though. A lot of practitioners make the same mistake." 4 seconds of silence. In the ballroom, the string quartet transitioned between movements. Someone laughed at a neighboring conversation. Champagne corks popped in the service area, but in the 3-foot radius between Paige and Nadine, the air had changed temperature. Paige's eyes narrowed. Not anger. Recalibration. The abrupt, disorienting experience of realizing the person you'd been patronizing just demonstrated expertise that exceeded your own. "The prudent investor rule," Paige's voice had flattened. "Of course." "Common area of confusion?" Nadine's expression hadn't changed. Still mild, still pleasant, still giving absolutely nothing away. "No reason you'd encounter it in corporate practice." The concession was gracious. It was also a scalpel, framing Paige's error as a natural consequence of her specialty, rather than a gap in her competence, which was worse than a direct insult, because it couldn't be argued with. Paige excused herself with a smile that had frozen around the edges. She found Constance near the powder room hallway. "Your daughter-in-law just corrected me on fiduciary standards." Paige's voice was low and stripped of its earlier condescension. Quoted the Connecticut statute number from memory. Constance's jaw tightened. "She works at a legal aid clinic. She probably memorized it to impress people." "Nobody memorizes Section 45-234 to make cocktail conversation, Constance. That's practitioner-level knowledge. That's someone who works with trust law, not someone who read about it." "Then she's overcompensating." But Paige didn't look convinced. She spent the remainder of the evening watching Nadine from across the room, with the wary attention of a woman revising her threat assessment in real time. At 9:30, Constance escalated. 3 hours, no tears, no retreat, no breakdown. The woman at table 14 was still calm, still present, still refusing to perform the humiliation she'd been invited to provide. Worse, Wesley had drifted back to his wife's side, standing near table 14 with a protective posture that Constance recognized as the first stage of a dangerous sequence. Protect the wife long enough, and the son starts questioning the mother. That sequence had to be interrupted before it gained momentum. She pulled Gemma aside near the service corridor. "Plan B." Gemma's eyebrows climbed. "Already?" "She's not folding. She's sitting there like she's running a clock, and I don't like it. We need to change the dynamic. Make her the problem, not us." Gemma understood immediately. She'd executed this particular maneuver before. In college, where social warfare was the unofficial curriculum, and the techniques were identical to the ones deployed at charity galas, just with cheaper champagne. She waited until Nadine and Wesley drifted toward the silent auction tables near the east wall, then crossed to table 14 with the unhurried stride of someone retrieving a dropped napkin. She sat, reached into Nadine's purse, the small black clutch sitting on the folding chair, found the phone. The passcode was Wesley's birthday, which Gemma knew because she'd watched Nadine unlock the device at a family brunch 6 months earlier. 4 digits. The kind of detail Gemma collected the way other people collected stamps. Messages. Wesley's thread. She typed, "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce. Don't come looking for me tonight." Sent. Phone returned, purse repositioned. She stood, walked away, and was back in Margot's circle within 90 seconds, holding a fresh champagne flute and laughing at something that wasn't funny. Wesley felt his phone buzz at 9:37. He was standing near the auction display, holding a bidding paddle he hadn't used, nodding at something Howard was saying about the wine selection. He pulled out his phone, read the message, and the color drained from his face the way water drains from a broken glass, all at once, completely, leaving nothing behind. He read it twice. "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce. Don't come looking for me tonight." From Nadine, sent 2 minutes ago. He looked up, found Nadine 15 feet away, asking a waiter whether the chocolate torte contained tree nuts. Relaxed, pleasant, showing absolutely no sign of a woman who just texted her husband a request for divorce at a charity gala. He closed the distance in 4 strides. His voice was tighter than he intended, louder than the setting required. "Did you send me a text?" Nadine read his face before she read his phone. Something was wrong. She could see it in the rigid line of his shoulders, the whiteness around his knuckles where he gripped the device. "I haven't touched my phone since I arrived." "Then explain this." He held the screen toward her. She read the message, read it again, and in the space between the second reading and her response, her jaw set. Not in pain, not in surprise, but in recognition. The precise, cold recognition of a woman who understood immediately what had happened, who had done it, and what it was engineered to accomplish. She took her phone from her purse, opened settings, scrolled to the device security log, a feature buried 3 menus deep that tracked every unlock event and app access with timestamps. The entry was clear: device unlocked at 9:31 p.m. Messages app opened at 9:31 p.m. Message sent at 9:32 p.m. At 9:31, she and Wesley had been standing at the auction tables, 20 feet from table 14. Her phone had been in her purse on the folding chair. 3 screenshots, 5 seconds, security log, sent message, timestamp discrepancy. She put the phone in her dress pocket. Not back in the purse, not on the table. In her pocket, against her body, where it would stay for the rest of the evening. "I didn't write that." Her voice was calm, factual, stripped of the panic the text was designed to generate. "Someone unlocked my phone at 9:31 while it was at my seat. The security log confirms the access. We were both at the auction display at that time." Wesley stared. Then his gaze tracked across the ballroom, slowly, inevitably, to where Gemma Schofield stood in a knot of women near the bar, not looking in their direction with an obviousness that functioned as a signature. "Gemma!" It wasn't a question. Before Nadine could respond, Gemma appeared, conjured by some predator's instinct for the moment when blood enters the water. "Wesley, what's wrong?" Her face was a museum-quality exhibit of concern. "I heard raised voices. Is everything okay?" Her hand found Wesley's forearm with practiced familiarity, her body angling to wall Nadine out of the conversation triangle. "Nadine, are you all right? You seem distressed." "I'm not distressed. It's perfectly okay to admit that this environment is overwhelming. Nobody would judge you for what, Gemma?" The question was quiet. 2 words, but something in Nadine's voice. Some frequency that lived beneath courtesy and beneath patience and beneath the 3 years of documented indignities filed in black and blue and red ink, made Gemma's performance falter. The concerned expression flickered, and for a fraction of a second, the face beneath it was visible, calculating, territorial, afraid of something she couldn't name. "For anything," Gemma recovered quickly. "These events are stressful for everyone." The exchange drew watchers. Nearby guests lowered their champagne and turned with the instinct of people who recognize the precursor tremors of a social earthquake. Constance, maundering from across the ballroom, felt it, the vibration of a plan encountering a force it wasn't built to withstand. At 9:50, Constance crossed the room herself. She arrived at the cluster near table 14 with the measured pace of a woman who'd spent 71 years entering rooms as though she owned them, which, in this case, she literally did. She placed one hand on Wesley's shoulder and one hand on Nadine's arm, and she spoke with the specific warmth of a hostess managing a situation she'd rather extinguish than address. "Darling, you look tense. Nadine, sweetheart, is everything all right? You seem overwhelmed." The word overwhelmed. Again. The Pemberton family's preferred diagnosis for any behavior by Nadine that didn't conform to the script they'd written for her. "I'm fine, Constance. Thank you." "Nonsense. You're practically shaking." She was not shaking. She was perfectly still. But Constance had spent a lifetime weaponizing perception, describing what she wanted people to see until they saw it. Perhaps some air? "Gemma, would you show Nadine to the terrace?" "Mother." Wesley's voice carried a sharpness that surprised everyone in the cluster, including himself. "She said she's fine." Constance's fingers tightened on Nadine's arm. Not a squeeze, a claim. Her manicured nails pressed through the thin fabric of the sleeve, 4 points of pressure that walked the line between affection and assault. "Wesley, I'm trying to help your wife. By announcing to the room that she's having a breakdown, look at her. She's the most composed person in this building." The observation was accurate, and its accuracy was the most dangerous thing about it, because Constance's entire strategy depended on Nadine's distress being visible, believable, confirmable by witnesses. And the woman standing between them was radiating the kind of unshakable calm that made Constance look less like a concerned mother-in-law and more like what she actually was. A woman trying to engineer a public collapse that refused to happen. Constance released Nadine's arm. 4 small crescents remained pressed into the fabric. She stepped back, recalibrated, and produced the wide, luminous, public-facing smile that had been getting her through uncomfortable moments since the Nixon administration. Of course she's fine." She touched Wesley's cheek. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, darling. Both of you." She turned and walked away, but the departure wasn't a retreat. It was a repositioning. And Nadine, who'd spent 3 years studying the way Constance moved through social spaces, the way a meteorologist studies weather systems, recognized the difference. The plan wasn't over. It was entering a new phase, and whatever came next would be less subtle than what had come before. At 10, something happened that wasn't on Constance's schedule. Or maybe it was, just delegated far enough down the chain of social influence that Constance could deny involvement. Nadine was standing near the silent auction tables, studying a framed painting donated by a local gallery, when a woman she'd never met, late 50s, emerald earrings, the hard smile of a person who'd been drinking for confidence, stepped directly into her space. "You're Wesley's wife." Not a question, a classification. "I am." "I'm Patricia Ames. Wesley and my daughter Rebecca were practically engaged before you came along." Patricia moved closer, the emerald earrings swinging. "I don't know what game you're playing, but some of us remember what this family was like before you inserted yourself. I'm sorry you feel that way." "Feel? I don't feel anything about you." Patricia's voice was rising, drawing the attention of guests at nearby tables. I see a woman who doesn't belong in this house, at this event, in this family, and I see a young man who made a terrible mistake because he was thinking with his—" "Mrs. Ames," Nadine's voice didn't rise to match. "This isn't a conversation I'm going to have." She turned to walk away. Patricia grabbed the back of her dress, fingers closing on the fabric at her hip and pulling, a hard yank that spun Nadine half around and nearly took her off her feet. The wine stain on her shoulder was still visible. Now a new mark, stretched fabric at her hip, joined it. "Don't you walk away from me? You people think you can just—" "Let go of my dress!" "Or what? You'll call the police?" Patricia laughed. The sound was ugly and wet and drew a wider audience. 15, 20 guests now watching the confrontation near the auction tables, some with the hungry eyes of spectators and some with the uncomfortable posture of witnesses. "I don't need to call anyone." Nadine reached back, detached Patricia's fingers from the fabric one by one, methodically, without force, the way someone removes a burr from a sweater. "But I'm going to remember this conversation, every word of it." She stepped away. Patricia stood in the wake of the exchange, chest heaving, emerald earrings still swinging, aware that the room was watching and unable to decide whether that was victory or exposure. Margot Sterling, 20 feet away, was texting. Not for her column. Not yet. For Constance. 3 words. "It's working." But it wasn't working. Not the way they'd planned. Every confrontation, The dress insult, the wine spill, the phone sabotage, the nails through fabric, and now the physical grab at the auction tables, was supposed to break Nadine. Instead, each one was generating evidence. Witnesses, timestamps, photographs of damaged clothing and forming bruises, a paper trail building in real time, documented by a woman who treated every insult as a deposition entry and every assault as an exhibit number. The plan wasn't breaking Nadine. The plan was building her case. At 10:15, it stopped being subtle entirely. Nadine was walking from the restroom back to the ballroom through a corridor lined with oil portraits of Pemberton ancestors, men with stern faces and women with jeweled throats, all of them staring down from gilt frames with the permanent disapproval of people who'd been dead long enough to judge everyone. The corridor was empty, quiet, removed from the gala's noise by 2 sets of doors and 30 feet of Persian runner carpet. Vance Kellner stepped out of a service alcove and blocked her path. He filled the corridor the way a boulder fills a river, not just occupying space, but eliminating the possibility of movement around him. Dark suit, no smile. The particular stillness of a large man who'd been trained to understand that stillness itself was a form of intimidation. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me. Is there a specific concern?" "Mrs. Pemberton has requested. I'm a guest at this event. Unless there's a security issue requiring my attention, I'll be returning to the ballroom." She moved a step around him. His hand caught her bicep. Not a guide, not a redirect, a grip. His fingers closed around her arm with the force of a man who'd spent 20 years learning exactly how much pressure to apply before the word assault became unavoidable in a courtroom. Muscle compressed against bone. Nadine's forward momentum stopped dead. Her feet slid on the Persian carpet runner. The impact jolted her shoulder socket, a sharp, bright spike of pain that radiated from his grip, point down to her wrist and up to her neck. "I said come with me." The courtesy had evaporated from his voice. What remained was instruction, the flat, unquestioning authority of someone who'd been told to handle a situation and intended to handle it physically. He pulled her sideways, not toward the ballroom or the exit, toward a service door at the corridor's midpoint, one that led to the estate's back wing. Staff quarters, storage rooms, spaces without cameras, without guests, without witnesses. Nadine planted her feet. The Persian runner bunched under her heels. She didn't pull against his grip. Pulling against a man Kellner's size was biomechanically futile and would leave the kind of marks that could be described in court as evidence of a struggle she initiated. Instead, she went still, completely still. Dead weight, making him work for every inch of movement. "Remove your hand from my arm." Her voice was controlled, but pitched to carry, to reach the cameras, to reach any ears that might be within range, to create an audio record that would survive anything that happened in the next 60 seconds. Kellner yanked harder. The motion jerked her toward the service door. Her left heel caught on the carpet and she stumbled, a forced, graceless stagger that wrenched her shoulder and sent a fresh bolt of pain through her arm, where his fingers were still compressing her bicep. "Don't make this difficult." His voice was low, bored, the tone of a man performing a routine task. "Mrs. Pemberton's orders. You can walk or I can carry you. Your choice." The corridor was empty. No guests. No waitstaff in sight. 2 security cameras, one at each end, small black domes recessed into the crown molding. Kellner either hadn't noticed them or was operating under the assumption that the cameras belonged to his employer, that the footage would be managed, that recordings could be edited or deleted by the woman who signed his paychecks. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Nadine stopped resisting the pull. She turned to face him, close enough to see the pores on his nose, close enough to smell the spearmint gum he was chewing, close enough that her next words would land with the precision of a blade between ribs. "You are committing assault in the 3rd degree under Connecticut General Statute Section 53, A-61. Her voice was unhurried, precise, clear enough that any recording device within 30 feet would capture it without ambiguity. Class A misdemeanor, up to 1 year of incarceration, $2,000 fine. And given that you're acting under instruction from your employer to restrain a guest against her will, Mrs. Pemberton has potential exposure under Section 53A-8 for criminal liability as an accessory." The statute numbers landed like stones dropped into still water. Kellner's grip didn't release, but the micro-expression that crossed his face, a flicker of the eyelids, a fractional tightening of the jaw, told her the information was processing. "You have approximately 5 seconds to release my arm before this becomes a documented criminal matter." She glanced at the nearest camera dome, then the far one. "I count 2 cameras in this corridor. If they're recording, you have evidence problems. If they've been turned off, You have obstruction of justice problems under Section 53-155. Neither option improves your position. His fingers opened. Not because the law frightened him. Men like Kellner had spent careers believing that authority was its own immunity. He released her because the specificity of her response, the statute number, the penalty structure, the instant tactical assessment of the surveillance landscape, didn't match anything Constance had described. This wasn't a timid woman out of her depth. This was someone who quoted criminal code with the fluency of a person who used it professionally. "Who are you?" The question escaped before he could catch it. "I'm a guest." She adjusted her sleeve where his grip had compressed the fabric. Beneath it, 4 bruises were already forming, pale ovals that would deepen to purple by morning and photograph as evidence by afternoon. "And you just made a very expensive mistake." She walked past him. He didn't follow. At the far end of the corridor, standing near the ballroom door with a tray of empty glasses, a woman in catering attire watched the entire exchange. She was older, late 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, the kind of composed, observant face that registered everything and volunteered nothing. Her phone sat in her apron pocket. The screen glowed faintly through the fabric, recording since the moment Kellner stepped into the hallway. Nadine passed her without breaking stride, but between them, invisible to anyone not watching for it, a nod passed, a millimeter of movement, confirmation that what needed to be captured had been captured, that the receipt had been filed. In the restroom, Nadine closed the door of the last stall and leaned against the partition. For 10 seconds, just 10, she allowed herself to feel it. The pain in her bicep, where Kellner's fingers had dug deep enough to leave 4 distinct pressure marks that were already darkening from pink to plum. The ache in her shoulder from being yanked sideways. The stretch marks in her dress fabric, where Patricia Ames had grabbed and pulled, the wine stain still wet on her left shoulder. She rolled up her sleeve, photographed the bruise from 3 angles, overhead, lateral, close up with her phone's flash to capture the color gradient. She photographed the wine stain, the stretched fabric at her hip. Each image was date and time stamped by the phone's metadata. She opened her leather notebook and wrote 4 entries in red ink. 7:55 p.m. Unnamed male guest, deliberate wine spill, physical contact, shoulder, table 14. 9:52 p.m. Constance Pemberton, fingernails through sleeve, left forearm, 4 marks. 10:02 p.m. Patricia Ames, grabbed dress at hip, pulled/spun, near auction tables, 15+ witnesses. 10:17 p.m. Vance Kellner, grabbed bicep, dragged toward service corridor, 2 cameras, Helen recording, 4 entries. 4 incidents of unwanted physical contact in under 3 hours. Each one documented with the methodical precision of someone building a file. Not for sympathy, not for social media, but for the specific purpose that files like this eventually serve. She rolled her sleeve back down, washed her hands, checked her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked exactly like the woman who'd walked in 5 hours ago, composed, unhurried, unbothered, except for the wine stain on her shoulder that was now dry enough to look like a wound rather than a spill. She left the restroom and walked back into the ballroom. Inside, the evening's program was approaching its showcase, the annual financial presentation. Constance retook the podium at 10:20, projecting slides of children in after-school programs, families at health clinics, volunteers at food drives. Beautiful images, compelling narrative. The visual grammar of philanthropy at its most polished. This year, the Pemberton Foundation dispersed $3.2 million in direct support of our community mission. Constance's voice filled the room with rehearsed warmth. Education, housing, health services, the causes that matter most. $3.2 million. The number glowed on the screen behind her. Enormous, impressive, designed to generate applause. And it did. 200 hands came together in appreciation of a woman who stood at a podium and claimed credit for generosity she hadn't funded with a single dollar of her own money. From table 14, behind the pillar, Nadine listened. And in her lap, beneath the tablecloth, her red pen rested on page 47. Sterling Consulting Group, LLC. $842,000. Services rendered, strategic communications and donor relations. Documented deliverables on file. None. No reports, no invoices with itemized services, no evidence that any work was performed. Schofield and Associates, $412,000, event coordination, 3 galas per year at approximately $35,000 each. Total reasonable cost, $105,000. Unaccounted balance, $307,000. Total reaching designated beneficiaries, $690,000. 21.6% of funds raised. Nearly 80 cents of every donated dollar was going somewhere other than the mission printed on the foundation's brochure. And the two largest recipients shared surnames with the two women who'd spent the evening helping Constance humiliate the person whose money they were siphoning. Constance concluded to sustained applause. She descended the stage glowing with the satisfaction of a performance completed. She had no idea that the most attentive listener in the room was sitting behind a pillar with a red pen, a leather folder, and 14 months of forensic documentation that would dismantle everything the applause was celebrating. At 10:40, Margot Sterling made a toast, unscheduled, unscripted, or perhaps scripted in the silent language that powerful women share. A glance from Constance, a nod from Margot, and the understanding that the evening needed one more escalation before the target escaped intact. Margot stood near the bar, glass raised, voice pitched to fill the room. A quick word about family. The room turned. The Pembertons have always believed in openness, in welcoming newcomers. Her gaze found table 14 with the accuracy of a laser sight. And I think there's something genuinely admirable about a family that embraces people from all walks of life, even when the fit isn't immediately obvious. Every eye followed the same trajectory, from Margot to Constance to the folding chair behind the pillar, to the Pembertons, and to everyone who's found their way in, however they got here. The laughter was quieter this time, less confident. Something about Nadine's sustained composure, 4 hours of unbroken calm in the face of escalating hostility, had introduced a note of dissonance that some guests were beginning to feel without being able to name. A woman at table 6, younger, newer to the Pemberton social orbit, set her glass down without drinking and looked at table 14 with an expression that was closer to discomfort than amusement. At table 9, a retired appellate judge named Feldman leaned toward his wife and murmured something that made her nod and look away from the stage. Not everyone in the room was participating in the cruelty, but the ones who weren't had spent the evening silent, which, in practical terms, produced the same result as complicity. Nadine raised her water glass, drank, set it down. Margot returned to her seat, passing table 14 with a wide berth and the satisfied expression of a woman who'd delivered her payload. But as she passed, she paused, just long enough to drop one final remark over Nadine's shoulder, delivered with the casual precision of someone sliding a knife between ribs. "You know, sweetheart, there's no shame in leaving early. Everyone would understand." She touched Nadine's wine-stained shoulder. A pat, light, patronizing. Her fingers pressed into the stain, as though testing the fabric's quality and finding it wanting. "Go home, get some rest. This isn't your world." "I appreciate the concern, Margot." Nadine didn't look up from the folder in her lap. "But I think I'll stay for the rest of the program." Margot's pat became a squeeze. Brief, firm, the kind of pressure that would register as affection to anyone watching from 5 feet away, and as aggression to anyone feeling it. Then she moved on, returning to her circle, already composing the text she'd send to her assistant about the evening's column. Beneath the table, Nadine turned to a page she hadn't examined yet, a supplementary appendix buried at the back of the annual report, printed in 8-point font on paper that was clearly intended to be overlooked. Vendor payment schedule, fiscal year 2023 to 2024. She'd reviewed the major line items a dozen times over the past 14 months. But this page, this granular microscopic breakdown of individual vendor transactions, was new. Added to the report sometime in the last 3 weeks, after she'd received her last copy from the Foundation's public filing. Her finger tracked down the columns, stopped on an entry dated August 12th. Payment, $68,000. Vendor, Kellner Security Solutions, LLC. Service description, event security and guest management. Kellner, the man who'd just dragged her toward a service corridor on Constance's orders. He wasn't just hired muscle, he was a vendor. A contractor being paid $68,000 a year through the Foundation. Through donated money, through her money. She turned back 2 pages, another entry she'd missed. March 19th. Payment, $31,000. Vendor, Pemberton Estate Management, LLC. Service description, facility rental for charitable events. Constance was charging her own foundation rent to use her own house. The foundation was paying Constance to host its own galas. Donor money cycling from the foundation's accounts back into the Pemberton family's pockets, laundered through an LLC that shared the family name without any attempt at disguise. Nadine circled both entries in red, then closed the folder. The picture was worse than she'd known. Not just administrative bloat, not just overpayment to friendly contractors. This was a closed loop. Money flowing from donors to the foundation to companies owned or controlled by the people who ran the foundation, cycling wealth upward while the stated mission of helping families received whatever scraps fell from the table. Table 14 scraps. Folding chair, behind the pillar scraps. She pulled her phone from her dress pocket and typed 5 words. The numbers confirm it. Proceed. Across the ballroom, the catering manager felt her phone vibrate. She read the message, set down the tray she was carrying, stepped into the service corridor, and made a call. Helen Chen for the Charitable Trust Unit. Reference number CT-AG-2024-4471. The material has been authenticated and will be available for formal presentation. The filing party will attend the next scheduled hearing. She hung up, smoothed her apron, and returned to clearing dessert plates with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had just activated a process that would take months to unfold, but whose first tremor would be felt before the night was over. At 10:55, Wesley found Nadine at table 14. He'd been watching her from across the room for the past 20 minutes. Through Margot's toast, through the laughter, through the slow revelation that his wife was not enduring this evening, but navigating it with a precision he'd never witnessed in 3 years of marriage. He'd heard about Kellner from a waiter who'd seen the security chief return to his post with the expression of a man who'd reached for a garden hose and grabbed a power cable. "Are you okay?" He sat in the chair beside her. "I'm fine. Your arm." He'd noticed the way she held her left arm fractionally closer to her body, the barely perceptible stiffness when she reached for her glass. "Kellner grabbed me in the corridor. It'll bruise." "He grabbed you?" Wesley's voice rose. Heads turned within a 15-foot radius. "It's documented. 2 security cameras cover that hallway, and a witness recorded the interaction on her phone. I've noted the time, the location, and his exact words for the incident report I'll be filing." Wesley stared at her. Not with confusion this time, but with the slow, vertiginous awareness of a man realizing that the woman he'd married existed on a scale he'd never measured. "Nadine." His voice was quiet now, careful, the voice of someone approaching a truth they're not sure they're ready for. "How are you this calm? All night, the seating, the toast, the phone, Kellner, and you're sitting here like you expected all of it." She looked at him, directly, with an expression that held 3 years of patience and 14 months of preparation and a lifetime of entering rooms where people assumed she was small because they couldn't see how large she actually was. "I need to tell you something." She opened the leather folder. "About the foundation, about your mother's financial presentation, and about who actually wrote the $3.2 million check that funds this entire operation." Wesley went still. "The anonymous donor, the one your mother thanks every year, the one whose money pays for this gala, the programs, the health clinic photo ops. What about them?" Nadine placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. A wire transfer confirmation from First Republic Bank, dated January 15th. Sending account, Okafor and Crane LLP. Amount, $3,200,000. Recipient, Pemberton Foundation. Donor designation, anonymous. Signatory, Nadine A. Okafor. "It's me." 2 words, no drama, no triumph, no orchestral swell. Just a woman at a folding chair behind a pillar, stating a fact that rearranged the universe. "The anonymous donor is me. It has always been me." Wesley picked up the wire transfer. His hands were shaking. "Okafor, that's your maiden name, professional name, the name on my law firm." She turned pages in the folder for him. The Connecticut Secretary of State business registration for Okafor and Crane LLP, founded 2014, principal office in Greenwich. The American Lawyer ranking listing them among the top 50 civil rights practices in the country for 3 consecutive years. The firm's client roster, redacted but impressive. You have a law firm? In Greenwich?" "A firm I founded 11 years ago. My partner, Julian Crane, manages daily operations. I stepped back from visible practice when we married because I wanted to understand your family before they understood me." "Understand them?" "Wesley." She placed one more document on the table. A formal complaint to the Connecticut Attorney General's Charitable Trust Unit. Reference number CT-AG-2024-4471. Filed that morning, documenting 14 months of financial irregularities in the Pemberton Foundation's disbursement records. "Less than 22% of the money I donated is reaching the people your mother claims to serve. The rest is cycling through companies owned by her friends, Sterling Consulting, Schofield and Associates, administrative overhead that would trigger an IRS audit if anyone looked closely enough." She turned to the supplementary page she'd discovered. And it gets worse. Your mother is charging the foundation $68,000 a year for Kellner's security services, paid through his own LLC, and she's billing the foundation $31,000 for facility rental, to use her own house, for events that benefit her own reputation. Wesley closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. The soft, conflict-avoidant man who'd spent 3 years choosing peace over principle was gone. What remained was harder, older, and very, very angry. How much? His voice was rough. Total. How much of your money went to this? Of the $3.2 million I donated, approximately $2.5 million went to entities controlled by or connected to your mother's social circle. Some of those payments may have legitimate justifications. Most, based on my audit, do not. That's what the AG's investigation will determine. $2.5 million. Yes. And nobody, no board member, no auditor, nobody in 19 years, ever noticed? The board is appointed by your mother. The auditor is selected by your mother. The annual report is prepared by a firm retained by your mother. The system isn't failing, Wesley. It's working exactly as it was designed to work. The only variable that wasn't in her control was who was writing the checks. Wesley looked at the wire transfer again, at the name on the signatory line, at the woman beside him who'd been riding the number 17 bus for 3 years while writing 7-figure donation checks from an account he didn't know existed. Why? The question came out broken. Why didn't you tell me? About the firm? About the money? About any of this? Nadine looked at him, fully, deeply, with an expression that held tenderness and assessment in equal measure. Because I needed to know who you were when you thought I had nothing, whether you'd defend me when there was nothing to gain from it, whether you'd choose me over your mother when I couldn't buy my way to your loyalty. And? What did 3 years tell you? That you love me, that you're afraid of your mother, and that tonight is the first time you've ever chosen me over her in public. She paused. That's not a criticism, Wesley. It's an observation, and it's a start. From across the ballroom, Constance had noticed something wrong. Wesley's posture, the folder, documents spread on the table that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She began crossing the room with the focused stride of a woman who recognized the preliminary symptoms of a catastrophe she hadn't scripted. Nadine saw her coming, and for the first time all evening, the first time in 3 years of documented silence and strategic patience, she smiled. Not the polite smile, not the patient one. The smile of a woman who had spent a very long time sitting in a very small chair, waiting for the person who put her there to get close enough to hear what she'd come to say. Your mother is 10 seconds away, Nadine said to Wesley, and she has no idea what's in this folder. Constance arrived at table 14. She saw the documents. She saw the wire transfer. She saw the AG complaint reference number in bold print at the top of a page bearing her foundation's name. And for the first time in 19 years of hosting the Pemberton Foundation Charity Gala, for the first time in a life built on control, on choreography, on the unshakable conviction that she could arrange any room and any person to suit her purposes, Constance Pemberton looked at the woman she'd seated at table 14 and realized she had no idea what was about to happen. Her gaze dropped to the wire transfer, to the number, $3.2 million, the same number she'd just projected on a screen and claimed as the foundation's triumph, the same number that had funded every rose arrangement, every lobster bisque, every crystal champagne flute, every folding chair behind every pillar in 19 years of galas. Her number, except it had never been her number. It had always been Nadine's. What is this? Constance's voice came out lower than she intended, stripped of its public-facing warmth, revealing the cold machinery beneath. What are you doing, Wesley? Read the documents, Mother. I don't need to read. What is this? She snatched the wire transfer from the table. Read it. Read it again. Her eyes found the signatory line, Nadine A. Okafor, and something behind her expression collapsed. Not the smile, not the posture. Something deeper than that. Something structural. This is a mistake. Constance set the paper down with hands that were no longer entirely steady. This is fabricated. This woman does not have $3.2 million. She rides the bus. I do ride the bus. Nadine's voice was quiet, steady, carrying no triumph and no malice. I also founded a law firm that generates sufficient revenue to donate $3.2 million to a charitable foundation. The two facts are not mutually exclusive. Constance looked at Nadine. Actually looked. Not the dismissive glance of a woman evaluating a threat level of 0, but the searching, desperate examination of a person whose entire understanding of a situation had just been inverted. The simple dress, the pearl earrings, the wine stain on the shoulder, the bruises forming under the sleeves, the folding chair, the pillar, table 14. Everything Constance had designed to diminish this woman was still visible, and none of it mattered anymore. The folding chair was still shorter than every other seat. The kitchen door still swung open every 90 seconds. The pillar still blocked the view of the stage, but the woman sitting there wasn't small. She never had been, and the evening was only half over. Constance's fingers pressed white against the wire transfer confirmation. The paper trembled, not from the chandelier's draft, not from the kitchen door swinging on its 90-second cycle, but from the specific vibration of a woman whose certainty had just been amputated at the root. "This is a mistake," she said it again, louder, as though volume could convert a wish into a fact. "Wesley, this woman is lying. She doesn't have this kind of money. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment. She takes the bus. I know what she does, Mother. I also know what that document says." Wesley's voice was quiet, but something in it had hardened, a tone Constance had never heard from her son, because her son had spent 44 years making sure she never needed to hear it. Then she stole it, forged it. This is identity theft, or fraud, or... "Constance." Nadine's voice cut through the spiral with surgical calm. "The wire transfers from First Republic Bank. The transaction is verifiable through their commercial banking division with a single phone call. The account belongs to Okafor and Crane, LLP, a law firm registered with the Connecticut Secretary of State since 2014. My name is on the incorporation documents, the partnership agreement, and every annual filing for the past 11 years. She paused. "Let the numbers do what numbers do. Sit in the air, immovable, impervious to emotion. I also have the original donation agreement, signed by your foundation's treasurer, acknowledging receipt of $3.2 million from an anonymous donor. Page 6. Paragraph 4 of that agreement specifies that the donor retains the right to request a full accounting of fund disbursement at any time. I made that request 14 months ago. The response I received was incomplete." Constance's champagne glass was still in her left hand. She'd been holding it since Margot's toast, and she'd forgotten it was there until this moment, when the crystal stem felt suddenly too fragile, too exposed, like holding a weapon that could shatter in your grip. "You're making a scene." Constance lowered her voice to the register she reserved for servants and situations she intended to manage into oblivion. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you found, this is not the time or place. You chose the time and place, Constance. You chose the guest list, you chose the seating chart, you chose to stand at that podium and present financial figures to 200 donors while the person who funded those figures sat behind a pillar in a folding chair." Nadine's voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. "I'm simply accepting your invitation." The cluster of guests near table 14 had grown. Not dramatically, nobody rushed over or caused a commotion, but the social gravitational field had shifted, the way iron filings rearrange when a magnet passes underneath. People who'd been heading for the exit paused. Conversations at tables 12 and 13 went quiet. Paige Whitfield, who'd been gathering her clutch near the coat check, stopped and turned back toward the ballroom with the instinct of an attorney who recognized the preliminary tremors of litigation. Constance saw the growing audience, and she did what she'd always done when threatened in public. She performed. "Everyone." She turned from table 14 with the wide, gracious smile that had anchored 19 galas. "I apologize for the distraction. My daughter-in-law is having a difficult evening, and I think we can all understand. I'd like to address the room." Nadine stood. The folding chair scraped against the hardwood floor. A small, sharp sound that carried further than it should have, cutting through Constance's performance like a wire through soap. "Sit down." Constance's composure cracked for the first time. The smile vanished. What remained was the face beneath it, sharp, territorial, afraid. "You do not have permission to—" "I don't need your permission." Nadine picked up the leather folder. "I'm the evening's primary donor, and I'd like to address the people whose generosity I share." She walked toward the podium. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience preparing to listen. The charged electric silence of 200 people watching something happen that wasn't on the program. Margot Sterling's phone was in her hand, but she'd stopped texting. Gemma Schofield had frozen near the bar with a champagne flute halfway to her lips. The state senator's aide was already on his phone, quietly briefing someone about what he was witnessing. Vance Kellner took 3 steps toward the podium before Wesley intercepted him. "Don't!" Wesley positioned himself between Kellner and the center aisle. "You've done enough tonight. Touch her again and I'll file the police report myself." Kellner stopped, not because Wesley frightened him, because the room was watching, and the room was full of people with phones and lawyers and social media accounts that could turn a private security contractor into a public liability in the time it took to upload a video. Nadine reached the podium. She set the leather folder on the mahogany surface, opened it, and arranged 3 documents side by side: the wire transfer, the Secretary of State registration, and the AG complaint. Then she adjusted the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who'd spoken at podiums before, at hearings and conferences and courtrooms where the stakes were measured in years and dollars and lives rather than social standing. "Good evening." Her voice filled the ballroom cleanly. No tremor, no performance, just the clear, measured cadence of a woman delivering testimony. "My name is Nadine Okafor. Some of you know me as Nadine Pemberton, Wesley's wife, the woman at table 14. A murmur moved through the room. Nadine waited for it to pass. "For the past 3 years, I've attended Pemberton family events as a guest. I've been seated at service tables, directed to servants' entrances, and introduced to this community as Wesley's situation." The word landed with precision. Several guests who'd laughed at Constance's toast shifted in their seats. "Tonight, I was assigned a folding chair behind a pillar, next to the kitchen door, at a table designed for overflow. The invitation email, which I have, described my seating as requiring a folding chair, quote, if necessary, end quote." She held up the printed email. Constance's words, Constance's signature, the event coordinator's one-word confirmation. "I'm telling you this not to ask for sympathy, but to establish a pattern, because the same person who arranged my seating tonight also arranged the financial architecture of the Pemberton Foundation. And the pattern of placing the most important element in the least visible position applies to both." She turned to the wire transfer. "On January 15th of this year, I authorized a wire transfer of $3,200,000 from the account of Okafor and Crane LLP to the Pemberton Foundation. Donor designation, anonymous." She held the document toward the room. "I'm the anonymous donor Mrs. Pemberton thanked in her opening remarks. I have been the primary funder of this foundation for 3 consecutive years." The silence deepened. The kind of silence that has physical weight, pressing against eardrums, compressing the air in a room full of people who were suddenly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the evening they were attending. A man at table 4 set down his champagne glass with exaggerated care, as though afraid the sound might break something. The woman beside him, his wife, based on the matching wedding bands, gripped his forearm and whispered something that made him go very still. At table 10, a philanthropist named Catherine Aldridge, one of the foundation's longest-standing independent donors, a woman who'd contributed $75,000 annually for the past decade, pressed her napkin against her mouth with the expression of someone suppressing either nausea or fury. She'd written those checks, believing they reached children in after-school programs. She'd attended these galas, believing the numbers on the screen were real. She'd trusted Constance Pemberton the way people trust institutions, reflexively, uncritically, because questioning the structure was more exhausting than accepting it. Okafor and Crane LLP is a civil rights law firm. I founded in 2014 with my partner, Julian Crane. Our principal office is in Greenwich, Connecticut. We've been recognized by the American Lawyer among the top 50 civil rights practices in the country for 3 consecutive years. She set the Secretary of State registration on the podium. The firm's name, her name, the Greenwich address, all printed in the unemotional typography of state government documentation. From the back of the room, Paige Whitfield made a sound, a small, involuntary intake of breath that she tried to disguise as a cough. She knew Okafor and Crane. Her firm, Crane Whitfield LLP, had been trying to schedule a meeting with the founding partners for 2 years. Merger discussions, partnership proposals, emails that went unanswered because Nadine had been busy riding the bus to Bridgeport and sitting at folding chairs, while the legal establishment she outranked tried to recruit her. "I donated anonymously because I believe generosity should serve the mission, not the donor's reputation." Nadine paused, and the pause carried meaning. It directed attention back to the woman who'd just spent 20 minutes on stage taking credit for generosity she hadn't funded. But when a donor's contribution is not reaching its intended beneficiaries, anonymity becomes complicity, and I will not be complicit. She opened the annual report to page 47. The red circles she'd drawn earlier were visible from the front tables. The Foundation's annual report, presented tonight by Mrs. Pemberton, states total disbursements of $3.2 million. The report describes those funds as supporting education, housing, and community health services. She looked up from the page. "That description is incomplete," she read, and the room listened the way a jury listens, with the focused, almost physical attention of people who sense that what they're hearing will require them to make a judgment. Line item: Administrative Services. Payee: Sterling Consulting Group, LLC. Amount: $842,000. Services described as strategic communications and donor relations. She looked at Margot Sterling, who was sitting perfectly still at table 3, her champagne untouched, her expression carefully blank. I requested documentation of these services through the donor agreement's audit provision. No reports were provided, no invoices with itemized deliverables, no evidence of any work performed. $842,000 for services that, as far as the available records indicate, do not exist. Margot stood, then sat back down. The champagne flute in her hand trembled, creating tiny concentric circles in the liquid that caught the chandelier light. Line item: Event Coordination. Payee: Schofield and Associates. Amount: $412,000. Nadine's gaze shifted to Gemma, who had not moved from her position near the bar. The foundation hosts 3 events per year. Industry standard costs for events of this scale average $30,000 to $40,000 per event. Total reasonable cost, approximately $105,000. The remaining $307,000 is unaccounted for. Gemma's champagne flute met the bar surface with a sound like a small bone breaking. Line item: Event Security. Payee: Kellner Security Solutions, LLC. Amount: $68,000. She didn't look at Kellner. She didn't need to. Paid to the private security contractor retained by Mrs. Pemberton, the same contractor who, approximately 90 minutes ago, physically seized my arm in a hallway and attempted to remove me from this event by force. A woman at table 6 gasped. The retired appellate judge at table 9 leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, the posture of a man watching a case he'd already decided. Line item: Facility Rental. Payee: Pemberton Estate Management, LLC. Amount: $31,000. For the use of this house, she gestured at the 14-foot ceilings, the hand-carved molding, the crystal that threw rainbows across the walls, which is owned by Mrs. Pemberton personally. The foundation is paying its founder rent to host events in her own home. She closed the annual report. Total charitable disbursements to the foundation's stated mission: after-school programs, housing assistance, community health services, $690,000 out of $3.2 million raised. 21.6%. The number hung in the chandelier light. Nearly 80 cents of every dollar donated to this foundation in the past fiscal year went somewhere other than the families and communities described in the brochure you received at your seats tonight. Some of those expenditures may have legitimate justifications. Administrative costs exist in every nonprofit, but a 78% overhead rate exceeds every benchmark published by the IRS, by Charity Navigator, and by the Connecticut Attorney General's Charitable Trust Unit, which is the office I contacted this morning. She placed the final document on the podium. The AG complaint. Reference number CT-AG-2024-4471. A formal complaint was filed at 9:15 a.m. today with the Connecticut Attorney General's Charitable Trust Unit. The complaint documents 14 months of financial analysis, including every line item I've shared with you this evening, along with supporting documentation, vendor contracts, payment records, bank statements, and correspondence. She looked at the room, not with triumph, not with vengeance, with the expression of a woman who'd given $3.2 million to help people and discovered that 78 cents of every dollar had been redirected to enrich the social circle of a woman who'd invited her to a folding chair as a joke. I came tonight because I was invited, because I wanted to see in person the room my donation paid for, the flowers it bought, the food it served, the champagne it poured. She paused. And I wanted to understand why a foundation that received $3.2 million in donor funding delivered less than $700,000 to the communities it claims to serve. She gathered the documents, closed the folder, and stepped back from the podium. I'm not asking for applause. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking the same question every donor in this room should be asking. Where did the money go? The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds in a room where 200 people held their breath, and one woman, standing near the head table with a champagne glass she'd forgotten to put down, understood that every structure she'd spent decades building was now subject to an investigation she couldn't control, conducted by an office she couldn't influence, triggered by a woman she'd tried to humiliate with a folding chair. If you've made it this far, you need to subscribe. Because what happens in the aftermath of this moment is something no one in that room saw coming. Hit that button now. Constance moved. She crossed the space between the head table and the podium in 6 strides, fast enough to communicate urgency, controlled enough to project authority rather than panic. Her silver gown caught the light as she turned to face the room, placing herself beside the podium as though she'd planned to speak next all along. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice was steady. The surface was flawless. Only someone who knew her well, Wesley perhaps, or Margot, or the woman who'd just dismantled her evening, could detect the fracture lines beneath. "I appreciate my daughter-in-law's passion, truly. Her dedication to charitable causes is one of the qualities that drew Wesley to her." She smiled. The smile was a weapon, wide, warm, designed to reassure the room that the adult was back in charge. However, financial oversight of a complex nonprofit is not a cocktail hour exercise. The figures Nadine has presented are preliminary, decontextualized, and reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of how charitable administration works. Our foundation undergoes annual audits by licensed professionals. Our books are open, and I'm confident that when the Attorney General's office, which I welcome to examine our records, completes its review, every dollar will be accounted for. It was a good speech, practiced even, or improvised with the fluency of a woman who'd spent a lifetime talking her way out of accountability. The room exhaled slightly. A few guests nodded. The instinct to believe the familiar voice, the authoritative voice, the voice that had presided over 19 successful galas and decades of social dominance, was strong, powerful, almost irresistible. But not quite, because Paige Whitfield was walking toward the podium. She moved through the crowd with the purpose of a woman who'd just done mental math that made her physically ill. Crane Whitfield, LLP, had provided governance consulting to the Pemberton Foundation for 3 years. Paige had reviewed the financials. Paige had certified the compliance documentation. Paige had signed letters attesting to the Foundation's adherence to fiduciary standards, the same standards Nadine had quoted at her earlier that evening, the ones Paige had gotten wrong. If those financials were inaccurate, if the overhead rate was 78% instead of the 31% reported in the documents Paige had reviewed, then Crane Whitfield hadn't just failed to catch the discrepancy. They'd certified it. They'd put their firm's name on a compliance attestation that was, at best, negligently wrong, at worst, complicit. "Constance," Paige's voice cut through the reassurance speech with the precision of a subpoena. "The Sterling Consulting payments, 4 quarterly installments of $210,000 each. I reviewed those invoices." Constance's smile flickered. "Paige, this isn't—" "The invoices I reviewed showed itemized services, strategic planning sessions, donor outreach coordination, media relations, 12 to 15 deliverables per quarter." Paige turned to Nadine. "You're saying those deliverables don't exist?" "I'm saying I requested them through the donor audit provision and received nothing." Nadine opened the folder again, extracted a single sheet. "This is the Foundation's response to my audit request, dated August 14th. It acknowledges receipt of the request and states that, quote, responsive documents are being compiled and will be provided within 30 business days, end quote. That was 53 business days ago. No documents have been provided." Paige took the letter, read it. Her jaw tightened with the particular expression of an attorney who realizes she's been used as a rubber stamp. "The invoices I certified showed work product." Paige's voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. "If those invoices were fabricated, then my firm attested to compliance based on fraudulent documentation. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a potential violation of Connecticut Rules of Professional Conduct, Rule 8.4, misconduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation." "Paige," Constance's voice dropped to the frequency reserved for urgent private conversations, but the room's silence amplified it. "We can discuss this privately." "No, we can't." Paige stepped back from the podium. She turned to the room. "My firm is suspending its advisory relationship with the Pemberton Foundation effective immediately, pending an internal review of all compliance documentation we've certified over the past 3 years." She walked to the coat check, retrieved her wrap, left. The room watched her go, and in the space her departure created, the vacuum of a professional ally abandoning the flagship at speed, other calculations began. The state senator's aide had already moved to the exit, phone pressed to his ear, briefing someone in language that mixed political caution with legal self-preservation. 2 couples at table 2, major donors whose names appeared on the Foundation's benefactor wall, stood and walked toward the foyer without speaking to anyone. A 3rd couple at table 7 followed, then a 4th. The hemorrhage was quiet. No one stormed out. No one made a scene. They simply left, the way water leaves through a crack in a dam, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Catherine Aldridge was among the first to go. She folded her napkin with the deliberate precision of a woman who was trying very hard not to throw something, placed it on her chair, and walked to the foyer without stopping to retrieve her coat. Her husband followed 3 steps behind, holding his phone to his ear, already calling the family attorney. A real estate developer from Table 5, a man who donated $100,000 in each of the past 2 years, stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked directly to Nadine. "I want a copy of that annual report, the real one, with your notes." He pressed his business card into her hand and left without waiting for a response. A woman from the Stanford Arts Council, who'd served on the foundation's advisory committee for 4 years, stood at her table and stared at Constance for a long moment. The look of a person recalculating a decade of professional association in real time. Then she removed the foundation's advisory pin from her lapel, set it on the tablecloth with the care of someone placing a flower on a grave, and walked out. Constance watched them go. Each departure subtracted something from the architecture of the evening. A supporter, a donor, a social ally, a person who'd been willing to believe the narrative because believing was easier than questioning. She counted 9 departures in 4 minutes. Then she stopped counting because the math had become a kind of violence. Each exit, another proof that the room she'd spent decades building could be emptied by a woman she'd seated behind a pillar. "This isn't over." She turned to Nadine with an expression that had finally shed its performance. Raw, furious, stripped to the foundation of a woman who'd spent 71 years controlling rooms and was watching this one empty on the authority of a woman she'd seated at a folding chair. "You planned this. You married my son to destroy me." "I married your son because I love him." Nadine's voice was steady, level, carrying no triumph and no concession. "I donated to your foundation because I believed in helping people, and I'm standing at this podium because you invited me. Remember? You wanted every guest to see what Wesley married." She gestured at the ballroom, the departing donors, the silent remaining guests, the documents on the podium, the empty champagne glasses catching light on abandoned tables. "Now they see." Constance's hand moved before her mind could intervene. A reflex, not strategic, not calculated, just the raw motor impulse of a woman whose control had collapsed. Her palm connected with the side of Nadine's face. Not a slap, an open-handed strike that carried the full rotational force of a woman who'd spent a lifetime believing that physical spaces and the people in them existed to be arranged according to her will. The sound was sharp, flat, unmistakable. Nadine's head turned with the impact. She didn't stagger. Her feet were planted, her weight centered, her body already braced as though she'd anticipated the possibility. A red mark bloomed across her left cheek. Her eyes watered from the impact, but she didn't raise her hand to the wound. Didn't step back. Didn't make a sound. The room froze. 200 people held their breath at the same moment. A collective gasp that sucked the oxygen from the ballroom like a vacuum seal. The retired appellate judge at Table 9 half rose from his chair, decades of courtroom instinct telling his body to intervene before his mind could calculate the consequences. Catherine Aldridge at Table 10 covered her mouth with both hands. A waiter carrying a tray of dessert plates stopped mid-stride and stood motionless, the plates tilting at an angle that would eventually become gravity's problem, but wasn't yet. The sound of the strike echoed off the 14-foot ceilings, off the hand-carved crown molding, off the crystal chandeliers that had been imported from Vienna a century ago by a Pemberton ancestor who believed that beautiful things existed to make ugly behavior more palatable. The sound traveled outward in concentric circles of shock, reaching the kitchen staff through the swinging door, the valet attendants in the foyer, and, through Helen's phone, which was still recording, anyone who would eventually watch the footage. Wesley moved first, 3 strides from his position near the head table. His hand caught his mother's wrist before she could pull it back. Not gently, not the careful grip of a son managing a parent's outburst, but the hard, unflinching hold of a man stopping an act of violence he'd witnessed and refusing to permit a second. "That's enough!" His voice broke through the frozen room like a stone through glass. Constance tried to pull free. Her face was contorted, the elegant mask shattered, replaced by something raw and furious and old, something that had been building behind the silver gown and the practiced smiles for 3 years, or maybe for a lifetime. "She's destroying everything I built. She's telling the truth about what you built. That's different." Wesley released his mother's wrist, stepped between her and Nadine, turned to his wife, touched her cheek where the mark was spreading, the touch so gentle, so deliberately tender against the violence that had just occurred, that a woman at Table 2 began to cry. Not for Nadine, not for Constance, for the distance between what families promise each other and what they actually deliver. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." She was. The mark would bruise. The bruise would be photographed. The photograph would be evidence. Everything tonight became evidence the moment Constance chose violence over accountability. At the ballroom's edge, Helen, the catering manager who'd been recording since the corridor incident, lowered her phone. She'd captured everything. The strike, Wesley's intervention, the red mark on Nadine's face. She saved the video to 3 separate locations: local storage, cloud backup, and a secure server that Nadine had specified 14 months ago when they'd first discussed the possibility that the evening might produce exactly this kind of documentation. Across the room, 2 people were already on their phones. The retired appellate judge at table 9 was speaking quietly to someone, his tone carrying the particular cadence of a man dictating observations for the record. The young woman at table 6, the one who'd looked uncomfortable during the toasts, was typing rapidly, her face flushed, composing something that would appear on social media within the hour. And Gemma Schofield, who had not moved from the bar since the receipts began, set her champagne on the counter and walked, quickly, without meeting anyone's eyes, toward the service exit. She was calculating. Not the foundation math, her own math. Schofield and Associates had received $412,000. If those payments were scrutinized, if the invoices were compared against actual services, if someone followed the money from the foundation account through Gemma's LLC and into her personal spending, the exposure wasn't professional embarrassment. It was potential wire fraud. It was tax evasion. It was the kind of financial trail that made prosecutors salivate. She needed a lawyer. She needed her accountant. She needed to be somewhere, anywhere, other than this room. She passed table 3, where Margot Sterling's chair sat empty. Margot had moved to the service corridor 60 seconds earlier, already on her phone, already leaving a voicemail for her attorney that was equal parts instructions and panic. Gemma found her near the catering staging area, pacing between stacked chafing dishes. "We need to leave, now." "I'm already leaving." Margot's voice was flat, stripped of the warm authority that had made her society column the most feared publication in Fairfield County. "My attorney isn't answering." "Call someone else. Call anyone. The AG's office has a complaint number." She read it out loud, in front of 200 witnesses. "That's a public filing." Margot stopped pacing. Her face in the service corridor's fluorescent light looked 10 years older than it had under the ballroom's chandeliers. "Sterling Consulting, the $842,000. Margot, did you actually do the work?" "Of course I did the work. Some of it. The important parts, the relationships, the introductions, that's what consulting is." The invoices showed 12 to 15 deliverables per quarter: reports, strategy documents, communication plans. They showed what Constance's office prepared for signature. I reviewed the summaries and forwarded them to the auditor. That's standard practice. Standard practice is having deliverables that actually exist, Margot. The AG is going to request those deliverables. And when they request them, what are you going to produce? 12 to 15 phantom documents per quarter for 3 years. Margot's silence answered the question more completely than words could have. They looked at each other. 2 women who'd orchestrated an evening of humiliation against someone they considered beneath them, now standing between stacked chafing dishes in a service corridor, realizing that the woman they'd targeted had been building a legal case for 14 months while they'd been planning seating charts. "Get a lawyer," Gemma said. "Tonight, before the subpoenas start." "And the LLC?" "Dissolve it, tomorrow. Every document, every email, every—" "Gemma." Margot's voice was sharp. "Destroying evidence during an active investigation is obstruction. If I dissolve the LLC now, If you dissolve the LLC now, the records go into storage. Standard dissolution procedure. What happens to stored records during a move is unpredictable." The suggestion hung between them. Margot's expression shifted, from panic to calculation to something that looked like the first cold assessment of self-preservation. They left through the service exit. Their cars were parked in the guest lot. They did not say goodbye to each other, and they did not say goodbye to Constance. Inside the ballroom, the gala was ending. Not with Constance's traditional closing remarks and standing ovation, but with the slow, uncomfortable dispersal of people who'd just watched a social institution collapse in real time. Guests collected coats and avoided eye contact. The string quartet had stopped playing. Waitstaff cleared tables around clusters of people who were talking in low voices, processing what they'd witnessed, deciding what it meant for their own involvement with the foundation. Wesley stood with Nadine near the podium. His mother had retreated to the library, the same room where Nadine had examined the annual report earlier that evening, and closed the door. No one followed her. For perhaps the first time in Constance Pemberton's adult life, No one in the building was seeking her attention. "I need to file the incident report." Nadine touched her cheek. The mark was darkening, not dramatically, but enough to photograph with clear documentation. "The assault. Kellner's earlier contact. The AG complaint is already filed, but the physical incidents need separate reporting. Tonight? Tomorrow morning. Stamford Police non-emergency. The video evidence is secured. Helen has copies on 3 storage systems. The bruise on my arm from Kellner will be fully visible by morning." She rolled up her left sleeve. The 4 oval marks from Kellner's grip had deepened from plum to a blue-black that would look devastating in evidence photographs. "And this," she touched her cheek, "will be documented at the urgent care clinic on my way home." Wesley looked at the bruises, at the wine stain on her shoulder, at the stretched fabric at her hip where Patricia Ames had grabbed and pulled, at the 4 small crescents on her forearm where his mother's nails had pressed through the sleeve. 4 separate instances of unwanted physical contact, 1 outright assault on camera. "I'm sorry," his voice cracked on the second word. "I should have—" 3 years, Nadine. 3 years of this, and Not tonight." She touched his hand. "We'll talk about the 3 years. There's a lot to talk about, but not tonight." He nodded, wiped his eyes, and for the first time all evening, the first time in 3 years, he looked at his wife without the filter of his mother's disapproval and saw her clearly. The woman who took the bus because she chose to, who lived in Bridgeport because she wanted to stay close to the communities she served, who wore simple clothes and packed her bag with military precision and checked the deadbolt 3 times, not from anxiety, but from the discipline of a woman who'd spent a decade building something enormous while making herself invisible. "The firm," he said. "Okafor and Crane. 11 years. You built a law firm for 11 years without telling me. I told you I worked in legal aid. That's not the same thing." "No, it's not." She closed the folder. "I practice civil rights law because I believe in the work. The firm generates revenue that allows me to fund the causes I care about without relying on institutions I can't control. The legal aid clinic in Bridgeport is one of 14 programs Okafor and Crane supports through direct funding. Your mother's foundation was supposed to be the 15th. Supposed to be. The money was supposed to reach families. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is standing in the library right now, trying to decide whether to call her attorney or her publicist first." They stood in silence for a moment. The ballroom was nearly empty. The florist's centerpieces were wilting in the heat of lights that had been burning for 6 hours. The mahogany podium still held the faint impression of Nadine's folder on its polished surface. "What happens now?" Wesley asked. "Now the process starts. The AG's charitable trust unit will conduct a preliminary review. That takes 60 to 90 days. They'll request documents from the foundation. Financial records, vendor contracts, board minutes, tax filings. If the preliminary review identifies sufficient irregularities, they'll open a formal investigation. That could take 6 months to a year. And my mother? Depends on what the investigation finds. If the discrepancies have legitimate explanations, and some might, the foundation could face restructuring requirements, new board composition, mandatory independent auditing, spending benchmarks. If the discrepancies don't have legitimate explanations, the AG has authority to pursue civil penalties, revoke tax-exempt status, or refer the matter for criminal investigation under Connecticut's charitable fraud statutes. Wesley absorbed this. "And Kellner? And what she did to you at the podium? Separate track. I'll file a police report for the assault tomorrow. Connecticut General Statute 53, A-61, assault in the 3rd degree, the strike to my face. And 53 A-61 again for Kellner's physical restraint. The video evidence is clear. The prosecutor will decide whether to file charges, but with multiple witnesses and recorded footage, there's a strong case. Will she go to jail? Unlikely. For a first offense Class A misdemeanor, the most probable outcome is accelerated rehabilitation. It's a diversionary program for first-time offenders in Connecticut. If granted, the charge gets dismissed after a compliance period, usually 2 years. No jail time. Wesley exhaled. So she does this, all of this, and walks away? She walks away from criminal consequences, probably. She doesn't walk away from the rest. The AG investigation, the foundation audit, the donor exodus you watched tonight, the social and professional damage. Nadine looked toward the library door. Your mother is about to learn what happens when the systems she relied on, social systems, financial systems, legal systems, stop working in her favor. It's slow, it's frustrating, it's often incomplete, but it's real. They left the ballroom at 11:45 p.m. The circular drive was mostly empty. A few catering vans remained, and the crew was breaking down the lighting rigs in the ballroom windows. The string quartet's cello case sat on the front steps, waiting to be loaded into a Subaru. Nadine and Wesley walked to his car in silence. The October night was cold enough to see breath, and the estate grounds, immaculate in daylight, maintained by a grounds crew whose invoices probably also appeared somewhere in the foundation's administrative overhead, looked different in the dark, smaller, less impressive. Just a big house on a manicured lawn, surrounded by hedgerows that couldn't keep out the consequences of what had happened inside. In the car, Wesley gripped the steering wheel without starting the engine. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question had been building all evening, and it came out with the weight of 3 years behind it. About the firm, about the donation, about any of it. Nadine looked at the estate through the passenger window. Lights were going off one by one as rooms emptied and the evening ended. "Because I needed to know who you were when you thought I had nothing." She turned to face him. "Whether you'd choose me when there was no advantage in choosing me. Whether your love could survive your mother's disapproval when I had nothing to offer except myself. That's not fair." "No, it's not. But it was necessary." She paused. 3 years, Wesley. 3 years of folding chairs and service entrances and Christmas gifts designed to tell me I wasn't enough. And in all that time, you loved me. I know you did. But you never once told your mother to stop. Not until tonight. The words sat in the car like a third passenger. Wesley didn't try to argue, didn't defend himself. Because the accusation wasn't an accusation. It was a description, accurate and specific, of the choice he'd made every time he chose peace with his mother over justice for his wife. "Tonight you stood up." Nadine reached across the console and took his hand. "When Kellner blocked the aisle, when your mother hit me, when I walked to the podium, you stood up. It shouldn't have taken this long." "No, but it's a start, and I need you to understand something about starts." She squeezed his hand. "The next 6 months are going to be very difficult. The investigation, the media attention. Your mother will fight. She has resources and connections and decades of social capital to deploy. People you thought were friends will choose sides, and not all of them will choose ours. I know. Do you? Because this isn't a single evening. This is a process. Slow, bureaucratic, often disappointing. The AG might find irregularities and impose restructuring. Your mother might agree to reforms to avoid criminal referral. Kellner might plead out to accelerated rehab and never see the inside of a courtroom. The outcome won't feel like justice. It'll feel like paperwork." Wesley started the engine. "Paperwork is fine." His voice was rough but steady. "As long as we're on the same side of it." They drove home to the Bridgeport apartment. Not to the Pemberton estate. Not to the house in Greenwich where Okafor and Crane's founding partner could afford to live. To the walk-up on State Street with the broken elevator and the cooking smells in the hallway and the neighbor in 4A who Nadine had helped with a lease dispute 6 months ago. It was the only home that mattered tonight. The next 6 weeks unfolded the way institutional processes always unfold. Slowly, procedurally, with moments of urgency buried inside months of bureaucratic patience. Nadine filed the police report at 10:15 a.m. the following morning. Stamford PD Incident Number 2, 024-SPD-11847. Reporting Officer, Sergeant Marcia Boone, a 20-year veteran who'd taken more victim statements than she could count, and who, despite that history, still flinched when she saw the photographs. Nadine presented them in order. The bruise on her cheek, now a mottled purple crescent below her left eye, shaped like a palm print, unmistakable in its origin. The 4 oval marks on her bicep from Kellner's grip, deep blue-black impressions arranged in the exact spacing of a large man's fingers. The crescent marks on her forearm from Constance's nails, 4 small curves that looked like punctuation marks, the body's way of recording the sentence Constance's hands had written. The stretched and torn fabric at her hip from Patricia Ames's grab, and the wine stain on her dress, not evidence of assault, but evidence of a pattern, a coordinated campaign of degradation that provided context for the physical incidents. She provided the corridor security camera footage, supplied by Helen Chen through a formal evidence preservation request filed under Connecticut's Freedom of Information Act. She provided Helen's phone recording of both the Kellner confrontation and the Constance strike. 2 separate videos, each with clear audio, each time-stamped, each showing exactly what had happened without ambiguity or room for alternative interpretation. Sergeant Boone reviewed the materials for 30 minutes. She asked clarifying questions with the careful, non-leading technique of an officer who understood that these reports sometimes ended up in courtrooms. She asked Nadine to identify each person in the photographs and videos by name. She asked about the sequence of events. She asked whether Nadine had sought medical attention. "Urgent care last night." Nadine placed the medical report on Boone's desk. The examining physician documented contusions consistent with gripping force on the left bicep, a contusion consistent with an open-handed strike on the left cheek, and superficial lacerations on the left forearm, consistent with fingernail pressure. X-rays negative for fractures. Treatment, ice, ibuprofen, and follow-up if symptoms worsened. Boone looked at the medical report, at the photographs, at the videos still frozen on her computer screen. Then she looked at Nadine, with the particular expression of a law enforcement officer who recognizes a case that's going to generate paperwork, media attention, and political pressure in roughly equal measure, and who is going to file it correctly regardless. "I'm documenting 2 separate assault complaints," Boone said. "One against Vance Kellner for the corridor incident, one against Constance Pemberton for the strike at the podium. Both will be submitted to the Stamford State's Attorney's Office for charging consideration within 72 hours. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Is there anything else you'd like to add to the record?" Nadine considered. "Yes. I'd like to note that Mrs. Pemberton's actions occurred in the context of a broader pattern of harassment directed at me over a 3-year period, documented in personal records I can make available if relevant to the prosecution's assessment. The pattern includes social exclusion, property damage, defamation, unauthorized access to my personal device, and the coordinated involvement of multiple individuals in actions designed to intimidate, humiliate, and isolate me from my husband's family." Boone wrote it down, every word. The state's attorney took 11 days to file charges. Constance Pemberton, assault in the 3rd degree, Connecticut General Statute Section 53, A-61. Vance Kellner, assault in the 3rd degree and unlawful restraint in the 2nd degree, Section 53A-95. Both Class A misdemeanors, both carrying maximum penalties of 1 year incarceration and $2,000 in fines. Both, in practical terms, unlikely to result in anything more than diversionary programs and the professional embarrassment of being named in a criminal complaint. Constance's attorney, Harrison Gill, one of Hartford's most expensive criminal defense lawyers, immediately filed for accelerated rehabilitation on her behalf. The application cited her age, her charitable contributions, her lack of prior criminal history, and her standing in the community. The hearing was scheduled for January. Kellner's attorney filed the same application. Different judge, same probable outcome. The criminal track moved at criminal speed, which is to say slowly. The AG investigation moved even slower. The Connecticut Attorney General's Charitable Trust Unit assigned 2 investigators to the Pemberton Foundation complaint. They requested documents on October 21st. The Foundation's attorney, not Paige Whitfield, who had formally withdrawn Crane Whitfield's advisory relationship the morning after the gala, responded on November 4th with a partial production. 12 boxes of financial records, 4 years of tax filings, board minutes from the past 6 meetings. The investigators reviewed the production and identified gaps. The vendor contracts for Sterling Consulting Group were incomplete. Invoices were present, but supporting deliverables were not. The Schofield and Associates file contained event coordination agreements, but no receipts for actual vendor payments, no florist invoices, no catering contracts, no venue rental agreements that would substantiate the $412,000 in charges. The Kellner Security Solutions file contained a single 1-page contract with no scope of services, no hourly rate, and no documentation of actual security hours worked. On November 19th, the AG's office issued a supplemental document request, targeted, specific, demanding the records that should have been in the first production but weren't. The Foundation's attorney requested a 30-day extension. The AG granted 15. Meanwhile, the Pemberton Foundation Board convened an emergency session on October 29th. 9 members attended, 7 who'd been appointed by Constance over the past decade, plus 2 independent members required by the Foundation's charter. The agenda had 1 item: the future of the Foundation's leadership. The discussion lasted 4 hours. 3 board members who'd attended the gala described what they'd witnessed: Nadine's presentation, the financial disclosures, Constance's assault. 2 members who hadn't attended demanded to see the documents Nadine had presented. The independent members requested an emergency audit by an outside firm. The vote was 7-2. Constance Pemberton was removed as Foundation chair. Not terminated, not disgraced, but transitioned to emeritus status, which was the nonprofit world's equivalent of a golden parachute. She retained her seat on the board in an advisory capacity. She lost her signatory authority over Foundation accounts. She lost her power to appoint board members or approve expenditures. She also retained her personal wealth, her estate, her social connections, and 2 seats on other charitable boards that had not yet decided whether the Pemberton scandal required them to act. Margot Sterling dissolved Sterling Consulting Group, LLC, on November 3rd. Quietly, no public announcement. The LLC's registered agent filed a certificate of dissolution with the Secretary of State, and the entity ceased to exist, along with whatever records might have documented what $842,000 in annual payments had actually purchased. The dissolution was legal. It was also, from an investigative standpoint, suspicious. Destroying the corporate entity through which the payments had flowed, 3 weeks after those payments became the subject of a state investigation. The AG's office noted the timing. Whether it would affect the investigation's conclusions remained to be seen. Gemma Schofield retained an attorney, a forensic accounting specialist from New Haven, and stopped returning phone calls from anyone associated with the Pemberton family. Her social media accounts went private. Her society column appearances ceased. She was, in the language of people who understood what happened when financial scrutiny met paper trails, getting her affairs in order. Page Whitfield's firm conducted its internal review and concluded in a 14-page memorandum distributed to all partners that Crane Whitfield had relied on documentation provided by the foundation without independent verification of underlying transactions. The memorandum recommended enhanced due diligence protocols for all nonprofit advisory engagements. It did not recommend self-reporting to the state bar. Whether the AG's investigation would force that question remained an open matter. If this story moved you, if it made you think about who we overlook and why, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because the next story is one you absolutely cannot miss. The merger discussions between Crane Whitfield and Okafor and Crane were, according to a terse statement from Page Whitfield's managing partner, tabled indefinitely. Nadine returned to the Bridgeport apartment on the morning after the gala and went to work at the Eastside Legal Aid Clinic as though nothing had changed. She unlocked the door at 7:15, started the coffee machine, sat at her desk with the same case files she'd been reviewing for months: housing discrimination complaints and wage theft claims, and tenant disputes with landlords who counted on their tenants' exhaustion. Mrs. Delgado in 4A brought her a plate of empanadas that afternoon. "I saw the news," she said, setting the plate on Nadine's desk. "The thing at the rich lady's party. Was that you?" "It was me. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Delgado. Thank you." Mrs. Delgado studied her face, the fading bruise on her cheek, the careful way she held her left arm. Then she nodded with the particular understanding of a woman who knew what it looked like when someone absorbed a blow and kept working. "The empanadas have extra cheese, for strength." She left. Nadine ate 2 at her desk while reviewing a Section 8 housing complaint that had been languishing in the queue for 3 weeks. The empanadas were good. The case was straightforward. The world outside her apartment had changed. Media coverage, social media commentary, phone calls from reporters and attorneys and donors who wanted statements or alliances or information. But inside the clinic, the work was the same work it had always been: small, specific, necessary. On December 1st, Nadine received a call from Julian Crane, her law partner, the man whose name shared the firm's masthead, who'd managed daily operations for 3 years, while Nadine conducted the longest and most personal audit of her career. "The AG wants to meet. Preliminary findings. They're not going public yet, but they want to discuss the scope." "When?" "Thursday. Their Hartford office, 10 a.m. "I'll be there." She took the train to Hartford. The AG's charitable trust unit occupied the 4th floor of a state office building that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. 2 investigators, a man named Rosario and a woman named Chen, no relation to Helen, presented their preliminary findings across a conference table covered in bankers' boxes. The investigation had confirmed the core discrepancies Nadine had identified. Sterling Consulting's deliverables were unsubstantiated. Schofield and Associates' event costs were inflated. The Kellner Security and Pemberton estate management payments constituted self-dealing. Foundation funds flowing to entities controlled by the foundation's leadership or their associates. Total donor funds reaching designated beneficiaries over the past 3 fiscal years, approximately 23%. 77% had been absorbed by administrative overhead, consulting fees, and payments to related parties. "We're recommending 3 outcomes," Rosario said, sliding a summary memo across the table. "First, mandatory restructuring. New board composition, at least 50% independent members. External auditing by a firm with no prior relationship to the foundation or its leadership. Annual public reporting of overhead ratios. Second, disgorgement. We'll seek the return of improperly dispersed funds to the foundation's charitable accounts. That number is still being calculated, but the preliminary estimate is approximately $1.8 million over 3 years. Third, referral. Rosario paused. The self-dealing pattern, particularly the Sterling and Schofield payments, may warrant referral to the state's attorney for potential criminal charges under Connecticut General Statute Section 53-441, fraudulent solicitation of charitable funds. We haven't made that decision yet. It depends on what the supplemental document production shows. Nadine listened, took notes, asked 3 questions. All procedural, all specific, all demonstrating the kind of practitioner-level knowledge that made Rosario glance at his colleague with the expression of a man who just realized the complainant understood his job better than most of his peers. What's the timeline? Preliminary report to the Foundation by January 15th. If they cooperate with restructuring, we can avoid litigation. If they don't, Rosario shrugged. Then it gets longer and more expensive for everyone. Nadine took the train back to Bridgeport. The ride was 97 minutes. She spent 80 of them looking out the window at Connecticut passing by. The suburbs, the industrial stretches, the shoreline towns where money had been old for so long it had forgotten how to be new. She spent the remaining 17 minutes reading a new complaint that had arrived at the clinic that morning. A family in Bridgeport whose Section 8 voucher had been wrongfully terminated. 3 children, no heat, no alternative housing lined up. The kind of case that wouldn't make the news, wouldn't generate social media attention, wouldn't produce dramatic confrontations at charity galas. Just a family that needed help from someone who understood the system well enough to fight it. She opened her notebook. Black pen for facts, blue for observations. She started writing. On a Tuesday evening in early December, Wesley and Nadine sat at the kitchen table in the Bridgeport apartment. The table was small, barely large enough for 2 plates, 2 glasses, and the folder of documents that had become a permanent fixture between them, like a third-place setting for the investigation that now occupied so much of their shared life. Wesley had moved in 2 weeks after the gala. Not dramatically, he'd simply started spending more nights at the apartment than at any of the 3 Pemberton properties he technically had access to. He brought clothes, then books, then a photograph of his father, Wesley Jr., who died when Wesley was 19 and who would have been, according to everyone who knew him, mortified by what his wife had done with the foundation he'd started. Mom's attorney called today. Wesley set down his fork. Harrison Gill. He wants to negotiate. Negotiate what? The accelerated rehab hearing is in January. Gill says if you agree not to give a victim impact statement, he can get the assault charge dropped entirely. Constance agrees to anger management counseling and a charitable contribution to, I'm not making this up, a women's shelter. Nadine set down her own fork. A charitable contribution, from a woman whose charitable contributions are currently under investigation for fraud. I told him no. I just wanted you to know. Thank you. They ate in silence for a moment. The radiator clicked and hissed. From the hallway, the muffled sound of Mrs. Delgado's television filtered through the wall. A game show by the sound of the buzzer. I looked up Okafor and Crane today. Wesley's voice was careful, the tone of a man navigating a conversation he wasn't sure he was entitled to have. Your firm's website, the case history, the staff roster. And? 14 attorneys, offices in Greenwich and New York. Federal Circuit Court victories I can barely pronounce, let alone understand. A client list that includes 3 civil rights organizations I've donated to. He paused. You could have told me. I know. Why didn't you? Nadine set down her glass. Because I spent 10 years before I met you building something from nothing. Law school on loans, a clerkship that paid less than waitressing, 3 years at a public defender's office where the copier was always broken and the caseload was always impossible. Then the firm, Julian and I started with 2 clients and a rented desk in a co-working space. Everything I have I built, and I needed to know that whoever I married could love the woman who took the bus before they loved the woman who wrote the checks. I would have loved both. I know that now. I didn't know it then. And your mother made it clear from the beginning that my value to this family was measured in assets I could contribute to its portfolio. If I'd revealed the firm, the money, the donation, she would have recalculated. She would have adjusted her treatment of me based on my net worth, and I would never have known whether this family's acceptance was real or transactional. Wesley leaned back in his chair. The kitchen light caught the lines on his face, lines that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago, carved by the specific stress of watching your mother be arrested and your wife be revealed as someone you'd never fully known. Was it worth it? 3 years of the chairs, the entrances, the book. Nadine considered this. The book was a self-help title about dressing for success. Your mother wrapped it in Bloomingdale's paper. A ghost of a smile. I donated it to the clinic's free library. A client's teenage daughter read it and used it for a school essay about classism. She got an A. Wesley laughed. It was the first time either of them had laughed since October 4th. But to answer your question, Nadine continued, no, it wasn't worth it. 3 years is too long to let someone treat you that way, regardless of the reason. I told myself I was gathering information, building a case, understanding the system I was trying to change, and all of that was true. But it was also true that I was afraid that if I revealed myself too early, I'd lose the ability to see people as they actually were. And I liked seeing clearly more than I liked being seen. The radiator clicked. The game show buzzer sounded through the wall. I see you now, Wesley said quietly. All of you. The attorney and the bus rider and the woman who eats empanadas at her desk. All of it. Good. Nadine picked up her fork. Because the AG's preliminary report comes out in January, and I'm going to need someone to bring me dinner while I'm working late. I can do that. I know you can. They finished dinner, washed the dishes. Wesley dried while Nadine washed, a small domestic routine they'd established in the apartment's narrow kitchen, a rhythm that was building, plate by plate, into something that felt more honest than 3 years of hidden identities and folding chairs. On January 15th, the Connecticut Attorney General's Charitable Trust Unit issued its preliminary findings. The report was 37 pages long, dense with financial analysis and statutory references, and landed on the desks of every media outlet in the state within hours of its release. Key findings. The Pemberton Foundation had disbursed approximately 77% of donor funds to administrative overhead, consulting fees, and payments to entities with financial ties to foundation leadership. The overhead ratio exceeded IRS benchmarks by a factor of 3. Vendor payments to Sterling Consulting Group, Schofield and Associates, Kellner Security Solutions, and Pemberton Estate Management lacked adequate documentation of services rendered. The Foundation's annual reports, as presented to donors, materially misrepresented the proportion of funds reaching charitable beneficiaries. Recommended actions: mandatory board restructuring, independent audit, spending benchmarks, and disgorgement of $1.8 million in improperly dispersed funds. The question of criminal referral was described as under continuing review. Constance Pemberton's attorney issued a statement. Mrs. Pemberton cooperated fully with the investigation and is committed to ensuring the foundation meets the highest standards of charitable governance. She looks forward to working with the AG's office to implement recommended reforms. The statement was carefully worded. It acknowledged nothing. It admitted nothing. It was the legal equivalent of a napkin placed over a stain, covering the surface without addressing what lay beneath. The Pemberton Foundation Board accepted the restructuring terms on February 1st. 5 of Constance's 7 appointees resigned. 4 independent members were recruited, including, at the AG's recommendation, a forensic accountant and a nonprofit governance specialist. Constance retained her emeritus seat. She attended the first meeting of the new board in March. She sat at the end of the table. She did not speak. The accelerated rehabilitation hearing for the assault charge took place on January 28th. Nadine did not give a victim impact statement, not because of Jill's negotiation attempt, which she'd rejected, but because she chose not to. The photographs of her injuries were entered into the record. The video footage was reviewed by the judge. Constance was granted accelerated rehabilitation, 2 years of compliance, anger management counseling, community service. If she completed the program, the charge would be dismissed. Kellner's hearing produced the same outcome. 2 years, no jail. The assault and unlawful restraint charges suspended pending compliance. He lost his security contractor license, a regulatory consequence that had nothing to do with the criminal case and everything to do with the video evidence that made its way to the licensing board. Gemma Schofield was not charged. The AG's investigation focused on the foundation's financial governance, not on individual recipients of foundation payments. Gemma's potential exposure, the question of whether she'd provided actual services for the $412,000 she'd received, remained an open thread. The investigators had noted the discrepancy. Whether they'd pursue it depended on resources, priorities, and the political calculus that governed which cases a state AG's office chose to fight. Margot Sterling was not charged either. Sterling Consulting Group no longer existed. The records that might have documented what services Margot performed, or didn't, had evaporated with the LLC. The AG's report noted the dissolution and its timing. It stopped short of drawing conclusions. The system had produced outcomes. They were real. They were documented. They were the product of months of investigation and legal process, and the particular kind of grinding, bureaucratic labor that transforms evidence into consequences. They were also, by any dramatic standard, incomplete. Constance wasn't in prison. She was at board meetings, silent but present, her wealth intact, her social standing damaged but not destroyed. Old money had deep roots, and Fairfield County had a short memory for scandals that didn't involve violence or children. She still attended the country club, though the corner table where she'd held court for 20 years was now occupied by a younger couple who didn't lower their voices when she walked past. She still received invitations, fewer, and from people lower on the social hierarchy she'd once commanded, but invitations nonetheless. The world hadn't ended for Constance Pemberton. It had merely contracted, and contraction, for a woman who'd spent her life expanding, was its own particular form of punishment, slower than prison, less dramatic than ruin, but persistent in the way that only diminishment can be. Margot wasn't disgraced. She was simply absent. Her society column continued under a different editor. Her name appeared less frequently at charity events. She moved through the social landscape like a ship that had lost its flagship status, but was still seaworthy. Gemma wasn't punished. She was scared, lawyered up, and quiet, which was different from accountability, though it sometimes looked the same from a distance. And the foundation, restructured, audited, governed by new people with independent mandates, was dispersing funds to actual programs for the first time in years. But whether those programs would survive the next leadership transition, the next budget cycle, the next board election, that remained an open question. Reforms are announced. Enforcement is what makes them real. And enforcement requires sustained attention from institutions that have a limited supply of it. On a March evening, Nadine sat in the Bridgeport apartment reviewing the AG's final compliance report. The radiator ticked. Wesley was in the kitchen making pasta, a new skill he'd acquired since moving in, part of the ongoing project of becoming a person who could function without inherited infrastructure. Her phone buzzed. A text from Julian Crane. New case intake. Housing discrimination. Family of 5. Stamford. Your neighborhood. She smiled, opened her notebook. Black pen for facts. Then she noticed the envelope. It had arrived in the day's mail, buried between a utility bill and a circular from the local grocery store. Plain white. No return address. Her name, Nadine Okafor, typed in the address field. Not Nadine Pemberton. Okafor. Her professional name. The name that had appeared on the AG complaint, the wire transfer, the Secretary of State filing. She opened it. Inside, a single sheet of plain paper. No letterhead, no signature. 7 words, typed in 12-point Times New Roman. The foundation isn't the only one hiding. She read it twice, set it on the desk, picked up her phone, and photographed it. Front and back, envelope and contents, postmark and address field. The postmark was Stamford, dated 3 days ago. She looked at the words again. The foundation isn't the only one hiding. Not a threat, or not obviously one. A statement, an implication. The suggestion that what she'd uncovered at the Pemberton Foundation was connected to something larger, something she hadn't yet identified, something that someone, anonymous, careful, deliberately unidentifiable, wanted her to know about, or wanted her to be afraid of. She turned the envelope over. Examined the adhesive seal. Standard self-seal, no DNA opportunity. The paper was standard 20-pound copy stock, available at any office supply store. The font was Times New Roman, 12-point default settings, the typographical equivalent of a blank face. Whoever sent this understood that anonymity required discipline, and they possessed it. She opened her laptop, searched the AG's public filings for any complaints related to Fairfield County charitable organizations filed in the past 3 years. 7 results. 3 were against the Pemberton Foundation. Her own complaint and 2 others she hadn't known about, filed by donors who'd independently noticed discrepancies, but whose complaints had been closed without action due to insufficient evidence. But the other 4 were against different foundations. Different names, different boards, same county, same pattern, high overhead ratios, payments to consulting firms with no documented deliverables, self-dealing through related party LLCs, 4 foundations, same architecture, different faces. She cross-referenced the board members, pulled up the Secretary of State's corporate registry, ran the names through the legal databases she accessed through the firm's subscriptions. One name appeared on 2 of the 4 boards. Not a Pemberton, not a Sterling, not a name she'd encountered during 14 months of investigation, a name she'd never seen before. She wrote it in her notebook, red pen. Then she closed the notebook, set it on the desk beside the anonymous letter, and sat for a moment in the quiet apartment, listening to the radiator click and Mrs. Delgado's television and the distant sound of traffic on State Street. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in a city where ordinary people needed help that ordinary institutions failed to provide. She opened her notebook. Red pen, for things that would matter later. She started writing. Outside, the March wind pushed against the windows of the apartment on State Street. 3 floors below, the bus stop for the number 17 route glowed under a streetlight, waiting for tomorrow's passengers. The walk-up's elevator was still broken. Mrs. Delgado's television murmured through the wall. Wesley was in the kitchen, washing the pasta pot with the careful attention of a man who'd recently learned that domestic competence was not inherited, but practiced. The world was ordinary and quiet, and full of things that hid in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough and disciplined enough and stubborn enough to find them. Nadine had spent her whole life being that someone. And the next case, whatever it turned out to be, however deep it went, however many folding chairs and service entrances and self-help books wrapped in Bloomingdale's paper stood between her and the truth, was already waiting. The foundation had been the beginning, not the end. And somewhere in Stamford, someone who knew the difference had just sent a letter, 7 words, no signature, no return address, to the one person they believed would understand what it meant. Whether that belief was an invitation or a trap remained to be seen, but Nadine Okafor, founding partner, anonymous donor, bus rider, clinic attorney, wife, and the most dangerous woman ever seated at a folding chair, had never been the kind of person who turned down an invitation. She'd learned that much from her mother-in-law.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.